By the 14th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was already bound together by networks of trade, diplomacy, and power that stretched from mainland Greece to the Levant and deep into Anatolia. Long before any conflict at Troy, this interconnected world had developed systems capable of sustaining wealth, warfare, and long-distance coordination. The Trojan War, if historical, emerged not from isolation or sudden provocation, but from the pressures inherent within this complex late Bronze Age system. Between approximately 1600 and 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by a small number of highly organized palace-based societies. These included Mycenaean Greece in the Aegean, the Hittite Empire in central and western Anatolia, the New Kingdom of Egypt along the Nile, and a constellation of city-states along the Levantine coast. Each of these powers relied on centralized administration, elite control of resources, and extensive diplomatic contact. Records indicate that these states did not operate independently. Rather, they existed within a shared political and economic framework that modern scholars describe as an international system. In Mycenaean Greece, power was concentrated in fortified palace centers such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. Archaeological excavations reveal massive cyclopean walls, administrative complexes, and storerooms designed for centralized collection and redistribution. Linear B tablets, deciphered in the 20th century, document detailed inventories of land holdings, livestock, textiles, weapons, and personnel. These records indicate a redistributive economy in which agricultural surplus was gathered by the palace and allocated to dependent craftsmen, officials, and military retainers. This system allowed Mycenaean rulers, known as wanakes, to mobilize labor and resources on a scale sufficient for overseas expeditions. One interpretive insight emerges clearly from this evidence. Mycenaean warfare was not an ad hoc activity, but an institutional function of the palace economy. The ability to equip ships, supply warriors, and sustain campaigns depended directly on administrative capacity. This connection between bureaucracy and violence helps explain how Mycenaean forces could project power across the Aegean and beyond. Across the Aegean, Anatolia was dominated by the Hittite Empire, whose capital at Hattusa has yielded one of the most extensive archives of the Bronze Age. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets record treaties, legal codes, royal correspondence, and diplomatic exchanges with other great powers. According to these texts, the Hittites exercised varying degrees of control over western Anatolia through vassal kingdoms, including a region identified as Walusa, widely accepted by many scholars as corresponding to Troy. These documents demonstrate that western Anatolia was not a peripheral frontier, but an integral part of imperial geopolitics. The Hittite archives also reveal sustained contact with a western power called Aegean, which most historians associate with the Mycenaean Greeks. Letters reference disputes over territory, accusations of supporting rebellions, and negotiations over political legitimacy. This textual evidence indicates that Mycenaean rulers were already active participants in Anatolian affairs well before any traditionally dated Trojan conflict. The implication is significant. Troy existed within a contested borderland between two major power spheres. Further south, Egypt under the 18th and early 19th dynasties maintained its own imperial network. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II describe military campaigns in the Levant and diplomatic exchanges with Aegean and Anatolian rulers. Objects of Aegean origin found in Egyptian contexts, including pottery and decorative items, attest to sustained contact. Egypt's role in the system was primarily as a stabilizing force, drawing prestige goods into its orbit while maintaining strategic interests along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Levantine city-states, such as Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre, functioned as critical intermediaries within this interconnected world. Archaeologists uncovered archives at Ugarit that include texts written in multiple languages and scripts, reflecting its role as a commercial and diplomatic hub. These cities facilitated the movement of copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia or Anatolia, timber from the Levant, and luxury goods across maritime routes. Their prosperity depended on stability, but also exposed them to disruption when great power rivalries intensified. Material evidence reinforces the scale of this interconnection. The Ulubaran shipwreck, dated to the late 14th century BCE, carried copper ingots from Cyprus, tin, glass, ivory, amber, and luxury items from multiple regions. The cargo demonstrates that late Bronze Age trade was not localized exchange, but a sophisticated, long-distance system involving standardized weights and elite consumption. This level of economic integration meant that control over choke points and ports had consequences far beyond local interests. A second interpretive insight follows. In such a tightly linked system, competition for strategic locations could rapidly escalate into broader conflict. Economic leverage, political prestige, and military access were inseparable. Control of a single node could influence entire trade networks. Within this framework, Troy occupied an unusually strategic position. Situated near the Dardanelles, the city controlled access between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, a route essential for the movement of grain, metals, and other resources. Archaeological layers at Hizarlik show repeated investment in fortifications, indicating long-term concern with defense and control. Troy was neither an isolated settlement nor a minor town. It was embedded within international systems that made its location valuable to multiple powers. By the 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean had become a landscape of competing palace-states, interdependent economies, and fragile diplomatic balances. The structures that enabled prosperity also generated tension, particularly where trade routes, political allegiance, and military ambition intersected. As regional powers consolidated authority and sought to protect or expand their influence, competition over key corridors intensified, setting the conditions for conflict that would later be remembered as the Trojan War. Troy was not a mythic city. It was a fortified political center embedded within the power structures of late Bronze Age Anatolia. Long before its appearance in later epic tradition, Troy existed as a real settlement whose material remains and textual references place it firmly within the geopolitical landscape of the second millennium BCE. Modern understanding of this city rests on the convergence of archaeology at Hizarlik and written records preserved in Hittite royal archives. The site of Hizarlik, located in northwestern Anatolia near the entrance to the Dardanelles, has revealed a long sequence of occupation layers spanning more than 3,000 years. Of particular relevance to the Trojan War tradition are the levels known as Troy 6 and Troy VIA, dated approximately to circa 1700 to 1250 BCE. Archaeologists uncovered massive limestone fortification walls at Troy 6, some over 5 meters thick, reinforced with towers and carefully constructed gates. These features indicate centralized planning, access to substantial labor, and a sustained concern with defense. The scale of these fortifications places Troy 6 among the more formidable urban centers of the late Bronze Age Aegean world. Excavations led by Wilhelm Dorpfeld and later Karl Blegen demonstrated that Troy 6 was a prosperous city, with large stone-built houses, paved streets, and evidence of long-distance trade. Imported pottery from the Mycenaean mainland, as well as local Anatolian ceramics, suggests economic integration with both Aegean and inland networks. The city's layout, with an elevated citadel surrounded by lower settlements, reflects a hierarchical urban structure consistent with elite rule. A key interpretive insight arises from these findings. Troy 6 was not merely a defensive outpost, but a regional center capable of managing surplus, trade, and political authority. Its architecture and material culture align more closely with established Bronze Age kingdoms than with marginal or isolated communities. The end of Troy 6 appears to have been caused by a natural disaster, likely an earthquake around the mid-13th century BCE. Collapsed walls and tilted structures suggest seismic damage rather than destruction by warfare. This distinction is crucial, as it separates the prosperous phase of Troy 6 from the subsequent level, Troy VIA, which is often more closely associated with conflict. Troy VIA shows signs of hasty rebuilding, subdivision of large houses, and increased storage within domestic spaces, possibly indicating economic stress or population pressure. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of violent destruction in Troy VIA, including burn layers, human remains, and weaponry. The city was destroyed around c. 1190 BCE, a date that aligns broadly with ancient Greek chronologies for the Trojan War. While archaeology alone cannot identify the attackers or confirm the narrative details of later tradition, it does demonstrate that Troy experienced a violent end during a period of widespread instability across the eastern Mediterranean. Textual evidence from outside Troy provides additional context. Hittite cuneiform tablets from Hattusa refer to a region called Wilusa, which most scholars identify linguistically and geographically with Ilios, the Greek name for Troy. These texts place Wilusa within the western Anatolian sphere of Hittite influence. One of the most important documents is the Alexandru Treaty, dated to approximately 1280 BCE, which records an agreement between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru. The treaty outlines mutual obligations, including loyalty, military support, and recognition of Hittite overlordship. According to the text, Wilusa retained its local ruler while acknowledging Hittite supremacy, suggesting a vassal or semi-autonomous status rather than direct imperial administration. This arrangement was typical of Hittite governance in frontier regions, where indirect control was often more practical than occupation. Another interpretive insight follows from this political relationship. Troy was not an independent city acting in isolation, but part of a larger imperial system. Its fate was therefore influenced not only by local concerns, but by shifts in Hittite power, diplomacy, and regional rivalries. Additional Hittite documents, such as the Tawagalawa letter and the Manapatarhunta letter, reference conflicts in western Anatolia involving Aegean, widely associated with the Mycenaean Greeks. These texts describe disputes over territory, support for rebellions, and negotiations between Hittite kings and Aegean leaders. While Wilusa is not always named explicitly in these accounts, the geographic overlap suggests that Troy lay within a contested zone where Hittite and Mycenaean interests intersected. The convergence of archaeology and texts allows for a measured historical reconstruction. Troy was a fortified city controlling a strategically vital corridor between the Aegean and Black Seas. It functioned as a regional center within the Hittite political order while maintaining economic ties with the Mycenaean world. Its prosperity depended on stability, diplomacy, and control of movement through the straits. A third interpretive insight emerges here. Troy's strength was inseparable from its vulnerability. The same strategic position that brought wealth and political relevance also placed it at the center of competing power systems. When late Bronze Age stability began to erode in the 13th century BCE, cities like Troy were exposed to pressures they could not easily withstand. By the end of the late Bronze Age, Troy had been destroyed and abandoned. Its role within the Hittite system dissolved as imperial authority collapsed across Anatolia. Yet its position at the crossroads of trade and power ensured that its memory endured. Troy's strategic location made it both prosperous and vulnerable, setting the conditions for the conflicts that followed. Mycenaean power rested on warriors, ships, and palace economies that transformed fragmented landscapes into coordinated political systems. Between approximately 1600 and 1200 BCE, the Greek mainland and parts of the Aegean were dominated by a network of fortified palace centers whose rulers exercised authority through control of land, labor, and armed force. This form of governance, often described as warrior kingship, combined military leadership with administrative oversight, enabling sustained mobilization beyond local boundaries. At the apex of Mycenaean political organization stood the wanax, a term preserved in linear B tablets and generally understood as the supreme ruler of a palace territory. The wanax was supported by a hierarchy of officials, including the loagidas, often associated with military leadership, and a range of regional administrators and scribes. Archaeologists uncovered administrative complexes at sites such as Pylos, Knossos, and Thebes that contained archives of clay tablets documenting taxation, land tenure, craft production, and military provisioning. These records indicate a centralized system capable of directing resources toward strategic objectives. One interpretive insight emerges from this structure. Mycenaean authority was inseparable from administrative control. Political power did not rely solely on personal charisma or lineage, but on the capacity to record, allocate, and enforce obligations. This bureaucratic foundation allowed Mycenaean rulers to plan and sustain organized violence, including raiding and expeditionary warfare. The linear B tablets from Pylos provide especially detailed evidence of military organization. Records list allocations of bronze, leather, and textiles for armor, as well as personnel assigned to coastal defense. Some tablets describe the mustering of rowers and guards in response to perceived threats, indicating that palaces monitored both land and sea approaches. According to these documents, manpower could be rapidly assembled from dependent communities, suggesting a level of logistical coordination necessary for overseas operations. Mycenaean society was dominated by a military aristocracy whose status was reinforced through landholding, weapon ownership, and participation in warfare. Shaft graves at Mycenae, dated to the 16th century BCE, contain swords, daggers inlaid with gold, and other prestige items that emphasize martial identity. Later Tholos tombs continued this tradition, linking elite burial practices to displays of military wealth. These archaeological findings indicate that warfare was not merely functional, but central to elite self-definition. Chariot warfare played a significant role in Mycenaean military culture, although its precise battlefield use remains debated. Linear B tablets record chariot components, wheels, and teams, suggesting that chariots were valuable and carefully managed assets. Rather than functioning solely as shock weapons, chariots may have served as mobile platforms for elite warriors or as symbols of status within the military hierarchy. In either case, their inclusion in administrative records underscores the organized nature of Mycenaean armed forces. A second interpretive insight can be drawn here. Mycenaean warfare combined practical military needs with social signaling. Control of advanced weapons and chariots reinforced elite dominance while projecting power internally and externally. This dual function helped stabilize palace authority while enabling outward expansion. Maritime capability was equally central to Mycenaean power. Coastal settlements, harbors, and island outposts formed an interconnected maritime network across the Aegean. Archaeological evidence of Mycenaean pottery in Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant indicates regular seaborne movement. Ships allowed Mycenaean rulers to conduct trade, establish influence, and carry out raiding expeditions. In the late Bronze Age context, raiding was not necessarily distinct from warfare or commerce. It functioned as a recognized means of acquiring wealth, captives, and prestige. Textual and archaeological evidence suggests that Mycenaean raiding culture extended into Anatolia. Hittite records referencing Aegean imply that Mycenaean leaders supported or led operations on the western Anatolian coast, sometimes in defiance of Hittite authority. These actions demonstrate that Mycenaean kings were willing to project force beyond their immediate territories when opportunities arose. A third interpretive insight follows. The combination of administrative capacity, military aristocracy, and maritime mobility positioned Mycenaean Greece as an outward-looking power. Its leaders were not confined to local competition but operated within a broader international environment where influence could be extended through force. The palace economy underpinned all these activities. Agricultural surplus collected from dependent communities funded craft production, weapon manufacture, and shipbuilding. Specialized workshops produced armor, tools, and luxury goods under palace supervision. This economic base made sustained military ventures possible, reducing reliance on immediate plunder and allowing for longer campaigns. By the 13th century BCE, Mycenaean Greece had developed the organizational structures necessary for coordinated overseas expeditions. Warrior kings commanded resources, manpower, and ships through centralized administration, supported by a culture that valued martial success. These structures enabled overseas expeditions, placing Mycenaean powers in direct contact and competition with Anatolian states across the Aegean. The Trojan War survives first as memory, not record. No contemporary inscriptions from the late Bronze Age describe a conflict called the Trojan War, nor do they name Achilles, Hector, or Agamemnon. Instead, the war enters history through poetry, preserved and reshaped over centuries before being fixed in written form. The Iliad, traditionally attributed to Homer, stands as the primary narrative source for the conflict, composed in its surviving form around the late 8th century BCE, roughly 400 years after the period in which the war is conventionally placed. Modern scholarship broadly agrees that the Iliad is not a direct historical account, but an oral-derived epic. Linguistic analysis, meter, and structure demonstrate that the poem emerged from a long tradition of oral performance, transmitted by professional bards who memorized and recomposed stories in performance. The consistent use of dactylic hexameter and formulaic phrases, such as repeated epithets and stock descriptions, reflects techniques designed to aid memorization and improvisation rather than precise historical documentation. This oral tradition preserved collective memory rather than chronological accuracy. According to comparative studies of oral cultures, such traditions tend to conserve broad narrative frameworks, places, social roles, and types of events, while freely adapting details to suit audience expectations. As a result, the Iliad offers insight into how later Greek communities remembered the Bronze Age, not a verbatim record of it. One interpretive insight follows directly from this process. The Iliad reflects a layered chronology. Elements from different periods coexist within the narrative, combining late Bronze Age material survivals with Iron Age social realities. This temporal compression complicates historical analysis but also preserves valuable traces of earlier systems. The poem's setting aligns broadly with the late Bronze Age world described by archaeology. Homer situates the conflict among palace-centered kingdoms ruled by warrior elites, whose authority is tied to land, honor, and military leadership. This social framework resembles what is known from Mycenaean Greece, particularly the dominance of elite households and the importance of martial prestige. The prominence of chieftains commanding contingents from distinct regions echoes the fragmented political landscape suggested by archaeological evidence. At the same time, the political institutions depicted in the Iliad differ in important ways from those attested in linear B tablets. The Homeric world lacks explicit palace bureaucracy, scribes, or administrative accounting. Authority is exercised through councils, assemblies, and personal persuasion rather than centralized redistribution. These features align more closely with early Iron Age Greece than with the highly bureaucratic Mycenaean palaces. This discrepancy suggests that while the poem remembers Bronze Age power structures, it reframes them through later social norms. The heroic values emphasized in the Iliad further reflect this blending of periods. Concepts such as kleos, glory, time, honor, and competitive excellence dominate the narrative. Warfare is portrayed primarily as a contest between elite champions, with mass combat serving as a backdrop for individual deeds. This emphasis contrasts with the administrative and logistical realities of Bronze Age warfare, but aligns with aristocratic values of the early Greek polis. A second interpretive insight emerges here. The Iliad preserves the ideology of heroic warfare rather than its operational reality. It records how Greeks chose to remember war, through honor and lineage, rather than how war was practically conducted. Despite these anachronisms, the poem contains specific details that align closely with Bronze Age material culture. One of the most frequently cited examples is the boar's tusk helmet, described in Book 10 of the Iliad. Archaeologists have uncovered such helmets in Mycenaean contexts dating to the 16th and 15th centuries BCE, long before the poem's composition. These helmets had fallen out of use by the Iron Age, making their accurate description unlikely to be a contemporary invention. Similarly, Homeric references to large tower shields, bronze weapons, and certain burial practices correspond more closely with late Bronze Age evidence than with 8th century realities. These survivals suggest that oral tradition preserved fragments of genuine material memory across centuries of transmission. They do not confirm specific events, but they indicate continuity in cultural knowledge. Textual analysis also reveals archaic linguistic features embedded within the Homeric epics. Certain words and grammatical forms appear to derive from earlier stages of Greek, supporting the idea of long-term oral preservation. This linguistic layering reinforces the view that the Iliad is a composite work, shaped by generations of performers before being stabilized in writing. However, the poem's narrative focus complicates historical reconstruction. The Iliad does not describe the entire Trojan War, but only a brief episode late in the conflict, centered on the anger of Achilles. Major events commonly associated with the war, such as the abduction of Helen, the judgment of Paris, or the fall of Troy, are largely absent or only alluded to. This narrow focus suggests that the poem was not designed to provide a comprehensive account, but to explore themes of leadership, conflict, and social order. Records indicate that ancient audiences did not treat the Iliad as pure fiction. Classical Greek authors such as Herodotus and Thucydides regarded the Trojan War as a real event, while acknowledging the unreliability of poetic embellishment. Thucydides, in particular, attempted to extract plausible historical conclusions from Homer, using the poem as indirect evidence for Mycenaean power and naval capability. This approach reflects early efforts to reconcile memory with critical inquiry. A third interpretive insight arises from this reception history. The Iliad functioned as a cultural archive rather than a historical chronicle. Its authority lay in shared acceptance, not empirical verification. This role ensured its survival and influence, but also shaped how later societies understood the past. From an academic perspective, the Homeric tradition must therefore be approached with methodological caution. Individual episodes cannot be read as factual reports, yet the poem cannot be dismissed outright. Its value lies in revealing how later Greeks conceptualized their Bronze Age predecessors and how memories of conflict were preserved, reshaped, and transmitted. Archaeology provides an external check on this tradition. Where material evidence aligns with Homeric descriptions, such as weapon types, fortifications, and elite burial customs, it suggests continuity of memory. Where it diverges, such as in political organization or chronology, it highlights the limits of oral transmission. Neither source is sufficient alone. Together, they frame the boundaries of historical possibility. By the time the Iliad was written down in the 8th century BCE, the world it described had long vanished. Palace societies had collapsed, writing systems had disappeared, and new forms of political organization had emerged. Yet the memory of a great conflict at Troy endured, carried forward through song and performance. To evaluate history, myth must be tested against evidence, and the Homeric tradition provides the starting point for that investigation, not its conclusion. Ancient scholars already debated when or if the war occurred. Long before modern archaeology raised questions about Troy's historicity, Greek and Roman writers struggled to reconcile poetic tradition with chronological reasoning. Their efforts produced a wide range of proposed dates, interpretive frameworks, and methodological assumptions, revealing both the importance of the Trojan War in ancient historical thought and the limitations of retrospective reconstruction. The earliest Greek historians inherited the Trojan War as a foundational event rather than a documented occurrence. Homer provided narrative authority, but no fixed chronology. As a result, later writers attempted to anchor the war within broader temporal systems based on genealogies, king lists, and relative dating. These methods reflected the intellectual tools available to ancient scholars, not empirical verification in the modern sense. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, treated the Trojan War as a real historical conflict, while openly acknowledging the uncertainties surrounding it. In his histories, he places the war within a sequence of interactions between Asia and Europe, framing it as part of a long-standing pattern of reciprocal aggression. Herodotus does not offer a precise date, but he situates the war several generations before the rise of historical Greek city-states. His approach prioritizes narrative causality over chronological precision. According to Herodotus, the Trojan War marked an early phase in the ongoing tension between Greeks and Eastern powers, a theme that resonated with his account of the Persian Wars. This framing reveals how historical interpretation was shaped by contemporary concerns. The Trojan War functioned as a symbolic precedent, reinforcing a perceived continuity between mythic and historical conflicts. A first interpretive insight follows. Ancient chronology often served explanatory purposes rather than analytical accuracy. Events were placed in time to support moral, political, or cultural narratives, not to establish verifiable timelines. Thucydides adopted a more critical stance. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, he evaluates the Trojan War through a rational and comparative lens. Thucydides accepts the war as historical but questions the scale and organization described by Homer. He argues that Mycenaean Greece lacked the economic and logistical capacity to sustain a massive, unified expedition for 10 years. Instead, he proposes that the war was smaller in scope and prolonged by logistical weakness rather than overwhelming force. Thucydides attempts a form of relative chronology by estimating generational intervals and comparing Homeric descriptions to known political structures. While he does not provide a specific date, his method reflects an early effort to apply critical reasoning to inherited tradition. He distinguishes between poetic exaggeration and plausible historical conditions, marking an important step toward analytical historiography. However, Thucydides' analysis was still constrained by the absence of archaeological evidence and written Bronze Age records. His conclusions relied on assumptions about early Greek society that were themselves shaped by later developments. This highlights a central limitation of ancient historiography. Even critical approaches operated within narrow evidentiary frameworks. More systematic chronological efforts emerged during the Hellenistic period. Scholars such as Eratosthenes of Cyrene, working in the 3rd century BCE, sought to construct universal timelines by correlating mythic events with astronomical observations and king lists. Eratosthenes famously dated the fall of Troy to 1184 BCE, a date that became widely accepted in antiquity and persisted into modern reference works. Eratosthenes' method involved counting generations backward from historically attested events and synchronizing Greek traditions with Near Eastern chronologies. While innovative for its time, this approach assumed the reliability of genealogical traditions and the uniform length of generations. Modern analysis demonstrates that such assumptions introduce significant distortion, especially when applied across centuries of oral transmission. A second interpretive insight emerges here. The precision of ancient dates often masked underlying uncertainty. Specific years conveyed authority, but they did not reflect independent verification. Chronology became an intellectual exercise rather than an evidentiary conclusion. Other ancient chronographers, including Apollodorus and later Roman authors, adopted or modified Eratosthenes' dating. The Trojan War was variously placed between the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, generally aligning with the end of the heroic age. These dates became embedded in educational and literary traditions, reinforcing the war's perceived historicity. Roman writers further reinterpreted the Trojan War within their own cultural frameworks. Virgil's Aeneid, composed in the 1st century BCE, presents the fall of Troy as the starting point of Roman destiny. While Virgil's purpose was literary and ideological rather than historical, his narrative reinforced the idea that Troy's destruction was a datable and consequential event. Roman historians such as Livy accepted Trojan origins as part of Rome's foundational myth, blending chronology with national identity. This Roman reception illustrates how chronology could function as political legitimation. Dating the Trojan War allowed Rome to situate itself within a prestigious ancient lineage, connecting imperial authority to heroic antiquity. Accuracy was secondary to continuity and symbolic value. Late antique and Byzantine scholars continued these chronological traditions, preserving and transmitting earlier dates with limited modification. Medieval chronologies often repeated the date of 1184 BCE without critical reassessment, demonstrating the durability of ancient scholarly consensus once established. From a modern perspective, these ancient chronologies must be evaluated as intellectual artifacts rather than factual records. They reflect serious attempts to impose order on inherited narratives, but they lack independent corroboration. Archaeological discoveries at Hizarlik and across the eastern Mediterranean provide external benchmarks that were unavailable to ancient writers. These findings suggest that a destruction of Troy via IA around c. 1190 BCE aligns broadly but not precisely with traditional dates. A third interpretive insight arises from this convergence. Ancient chronologies were not entirely arbitrary. While methodologically flawed, they preserved a general temporal memory that places the conflict near the end of the Late Bronze Age. This correspondence supports the possibility of a historical core without validating specific dates or narrative details. The methodological limits of later retrospection remain central to the debate. Ancient historians worked backward from known realities, projecting familiar political structures and values onto distant periods. Their reconstructions tell us as much about their own societies as about the Bronze Age. Recognizing these constraints allows modern scholarship to use ancient testimony cautiously, extracting contextual insight without accepting chronological claims at face value. In sum, ancient chronologies of the Trojan War reveal a sustained effort to transform memory into history. From Herodotus' narrative framing to Thucydides' critical analysis and Eratosthenes' calculated dates, each approach reflects evolving standards of historical reasoning. These debates frame modern investigation, providing a record of how the Trojan War was understood long before archaeology reopened the question of its historical foundations. Geography often precedes ideology. In the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, control of land and sea corridors shaped political priorities long before conflicts were explained through myth or heroic narrative. The region surrounding the Dardanelles exemplifies this dynamic. Long before Troy became a subject of epic memory, its location placed it at the intersection of major economic systems whose stability depended on access, movement, and regulation of trade. The Dardanelles Strait connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and onward to the Black Sea. In the late Bronze Age, this route provided access to critical resources unavailable in sufficient quantities in the Aegean basin. Among these were grain from the Pontic steppe regions, timber from northern Anatolia and the Balkans, and metals, including copper and possibly tin, circulating through inland trade routes. Control of this maritime corridor offered economic leverage that extended far beyond local interests. Archaeological evidence indicates that Black Sea grain was increasingly significant during the late Bronze Age, particularly for regions with limited agricultural capacity. Mycenaean Greece, characterized by mountainous terrain and variable rainfall, relied heavily on redistribution systems to manage food security. Linear B tablets from Pilus document detailed accounting of grain production and storage, suggesting sensitivity to supply fluctuations. Access to supplementary grain sources would have reduced vulnerability to local shortages and enhanced political stability. A first interpretive insight emerges from this context. Economic security in the late Bronze Age was geographically uneven. Regions with constrained agricultural output depended on trade routes rather than territorial expansion alone. As a result, controlling access points such as the Dardanelles could substitute for direct control over distant production zones. Metals formed another critical component of Bronze Age economies. Bronze production required both copper and tin, materials rarely found together. Copper was available from sources such as Cyprus, while tin likely traveled long distances from central Anatolia, Afghanistan, or other regions through complex exchange networks. The Ulubran shipwreck demonstrates how these materials circulated together alongside finished goods, indicating centralized coordination and elite oversight. Any disruption along key maritime routes could have cascading effects on weapon production, toolmaking, and elite prestige. Timber was equally vital. Shipbuilding, construction, and chariot manufacture all depended on high-quality wood, which was scarce in parts of the Aegean. Northern Anatolia and regions bordering the Black Sea provided access to dense forests suitable for these purposes. Hittite texts reference timber shipments and forest management, underscoring its strategic value. Control over routes leading to these resources enhanced both military and economic capacity. Troy's location placed it in a position to influence, regulate, or tax movement through the strait. Archaeological layers at Hizarlik show continuous investment in fortifications and infrastructure, suggesting long-term engagement with trade rather than episodic activity. Imported Mycenaean pottery found at Troy indicates active exchange with the Greek mainland, while inland connections tied the city to Anatolian networks. This dual orientation made Troy an intermediary between maritime and overland systems. A second interpretive insight follows. Troy functioned less as an isolated endpoint and more as a gateway economy. Its prosperity depended on facilitating movement while asserting authority over passage. Such roles often generated tension, particularly when external powers sought to bypass intermediaries or reduce transactional costs through force. For Mycenaean elites, access to Anatolian and Black Sea resources aligned with broader patterns of outward expansion. Archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean presence across the eastern Aegean, including settlements and trading posts on islands and coastal Anatolia. These sites suggest sustained engagement rather than sporadic contact. Hittite references to Ahiwa further confirm that Mycenaean leaders were recognized actors in Anatolian affairs, capable of influencing local politics. From the Mycenaean perspective, Troy represented both opportunity and constraint. Cooperation enabled access to valuable resources, but dependence on a strategically positioned intermediary limited autonomy. As Mycenaean maritime capability increased, the incentive to secure more direct or favorable access intensified. In this context, economic motives need not imply deliberate conquest. Pressure could arise gradually through competition, negotiation failures, and episodic violence. The Hittite Empire added another layer of complexity. As Troy existed within the Hittite sphere of influence, any disruption to its control over the straits had implications for imperial stability. Hittite interest in Western Anatolia focused on maintaining loyalty among vassals and preventing rival powers from gaining footholds. Hittite texts describing conflicts in the region suggest recurring instability, often linked to local rulers shifting allegiances or external interference. A third interpretive insight emerges here. Strategic competition in the Late Bronze Age was rarely binary. Economic interests intersected with imperial governance, local autonomy, and personal rulership. Conflict could emerge not from a single cause, but from the accumulation of competing priorities across multiple levels of authority. The Late Bronze Age international system depended on predictability. Trade routes required security, diplomatic agreements, and shared expectations. When these conditions weakened, through environmental stress, political turnover, or shifting power balances, economic competition became more volatile. Control points like Troy were particularly exposed, as their value increased precisely when stability declined. By the 13th century BCE, pressures on the eastern Mediterranean system intensified. Evidence from multiple regions indicates increasing militarization, fortification, and resource strain. In such an environment, economic competition was unlikely to remain confined to trade negotiations. The strategic importance of the Dardanelles made Troy a focal point where broader systemic tensions converged. Economic tension interacted with political rivalry, transforming geography into conflict and setting the conditions under which competition over access and control could escalate into war. Bronze Age diplomacy frequently failed. Although late Bronze Age states developed formal systems of treaties, correspondence, and negotiated obligations, these mechanisms operated within a volatile environment where military force remained an accepted instrument of policy. In Western Anatolia, written evidence from the Hittite royal archives reveals a pattern of unresolved disputes, shifting alliances, and repeated outbreaks of violence involving local rulers and foreign powers. These records provide the clearest textual window into the political conditions that framed any potential conflict at Troy. The Hittite Empire maintained extensive diplomatic relations across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. Treaties defined vassal obligations, correspondence addressed grievances, and royal edicts attempted to enforce order along imperial frontiers. However, Western Anatolia remained particularly unstable. The region consisted of semi-autonomous kingdoms whose loyalty to the Hittite crown was often conditional and contested. Geography, distance from the imperial center, and external influence all contributed to recurring instability. One of the most significant documents illustrating this instability is the Manapatarhunta letter, dated to the mid-13th century BCE. This text, sent by the Hittite king to a Western Anatolian ruler, describes military unrest and rebellion involving Wilusa and neighboring regions. The letter references attacks, shifting allegiances, and the involvement of a figure named Payamaradu, a recurring antagonist in Hittite correspondence. Payamaradu appears as a local warlord or rebel leader who repeatedly challenged Hittite authority. often with external support. According to the letter, Wilusa experienced internal disruption that required Hittite intervention. Although the text does not describe a large-scale war, it demonstrates that Troy's region was already exposed to conflict driven by local ambitions and imperial enforcement. This evidence undermines the notion of a long period of peaceful isolation prior to any Trojan War and instead situates Troy within an environment of chronic political tension. A first interpretive insight arises from these texts. Late Bronze Age political order in Western Anatolia was maintained through coercion as much as diplomacy. Treaties established norms, but enforcement depended on military capability and loyalty that could not be guaranteed. The Tawagalawa letter provides further insight into interstate conflict and the role of Aegean, widely identified with Mycenaean Greece. This letter, sent by a Hittite king, likely Hattusili III, to the king of Aegean, addresses disputes over Western Anatolian territories and individuals who had acted against Hittite interests. The tone of the letter is diplomatic but strained, reflecting an attempt to resolve conflict through negotiation rather than immediate warfare. Notably, the Hittite king addresses his Aegean counterpart as a brother, a term reserved for rulers of equal status. This suggests that Aegean was recognized as a major power, capable of influencing events far from its core territories. The letter discusses previous hostilities and references military actions involving Western Anatolian regions, implying that Aegean involvement was not incidental but sustained. The Tawagalawa letter also mentions Wilusa indirectly, reinforcing the idea that Troy lay within a contested zone influenced by both Hittite and Mycenaean interests. While the letter attempts reconciliation, its existence indicates that earlier diplomatic efforts had failed to prevent violence. Negotiation appears as a response to conflict rather than a preventative measure. A second interpretive insight follows. Aegean power projection into Anatolia blurred the boundary between raiding and diplomacy. Military action and negotiation functioned as complementary tools rather than mutually exclusive alternatives. This pattern complicates any attempt to isolate a single triggering event for conflict. Raiding played a central role in this environment. In the late Bronze Age, raiding was not necessarily distinct from warfare or piracy. It represented a socially sanctioned method of acquiring wealth, captives, and leverage. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements and weapon proliferation across Anatolia and the Aegean suggests widespread insecurity. Textual references to population displacement and punitive campaigns reinforce this picture. For local Anatolian rulers, aligning with external powers such as Aegean could provide short-term advantages against imperial control. For Mycenaean leaders, supporting local unrest expanded influence without requiring formal annexation. These dynamics fostered cycles of retaliation, destabilizing frontier regions like Wilusa. Hittite efforts to contain this instability relied on punitive expeditions and renegotiated treaties. However, the persistence of figures like Payamaradu demonstrates the limits of imperial control. Even when rebellions were suppressed, underlying grievances remained unresolved. Over time, repeated interventions strained resources and eroded authority. A third interpretive insight emerges from this pattern. Frontier zones in the late Bronze Age were structurally prone to violence. Distance from central authority, competition between great powers, and the economic value of key regions combined to make sustained peace unlikely. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was the normalization of interstate violence. Conflict did not require formal declarations or singular causes. Instead, it emerged from overlapping disputes over loyalty, territory, and access to resources. Written diplomacy attempted to manage these pressures, but its effectiveness was limited by enforcement capacity and competing interests. By the 13th century BCE, Western Anatolia had become a landscape where diplomacy repeatedly gave way to force. The surviving texts reveal a world in which negotiation followed conflict rather than preventing it. Conflict escalated beyond negotiation, setting the conditions under which localized violence could expand into larger confrontations remembered in later tradition. Myth framed war in personal terms. In later Greek tradition, the Trojan War was explained not through trade routes or strategic competition, but through a single act of personal transgression, the abduction of Helen by Paris of Troy. This narrative provided a clear and emotionally comprehensible cause for conflict, transforming systemic tensions into a story of violated marriage, offended honor, and collective obligation. While not a historical explanation in the modern sense, the mythic casus belli offers insight into the social values that shaped how later Greeks understood warfare and alliance. Within the Homeric tradition, Helen's abduction functions as a breach of Xenia, the formalized code of guest friendship that governed relations among elites. According to the narrative, Paris violated this code while a guest in the household of Menelaus, king of Sparta. In societies where written contracts were limited, such customs carried legal and moral weight. Violations of Xenia were not private matters. They undermined trust between ruling households and destabilized interpolity relations. This emphasis reflects values consistent with aristocratic societies in which personal relationships structured political order. Marriage alliances, gift exchange, and hospitality created networks of obligation that linked distant communities. When such bonds were broken, retaliation was framed as necessary to restore balance. The story of Helen thus provided a socially intelligible justification for collective action. A first interpretive insight emerges here. The mythic explanation of the war encodes social norms rather than strategic realities. By personalizing conflict, the tradition rendered large-scale violence morally legible within an elite value system centered on honor and reciprocity. The Oath of Tyndareus further reinforces this framework. According to later sources, Helen's suitors swore an oath to defend her chosen husband against any future violation. This device explains how a wide coalition of Greek leaders could be mobilized in response to a personal offense. Historically, such an oath has no direct attestation, but its narrative function is clear. It translates the mechanics of alliance formation into a moral obligation rooted in shared honor. From an analytical perspective, this mythic mechanism parallels known patterns of alliance behavior in early societies. Agreements between elites often relied on personal guarantees rather than institutional enforcement. The oath narrative retroactively rationalizes coalition warfare by embedding it within a code of collective responsibility. Helen herself occupies a complex role within this system. In Homeric poetry, she is both a passive object and an active moral agent, reflecting ambivalence about female agency in aristocratic exchange. Her movement from Sparta to Troy symbolizes the transfer of status, legitimacy, and conflict between male-dominated households. This portrayal aligns with anthropological models in which women serve as conduits of alliance and rivalry. A second interpretive insight follows. Helen's abduction functions as a symbolic representation of elite competition. The conflict is not truly about an individual woman, but about control over status, reputation, and relational order among ruling families. The mythic narrative also reflects the heroic value system emphasized in epic poetry. Leaders are motivated by time, honor, and kleos, glory, rather than material gain. War is depicted as a moral arena in which reputation is earned and preserved. This framing obscures economic and strategic motives, but it reveals how later Greeks conceptualized legitimate violence. Importantly, this ideological lens does not negate the possibility of historical conflict. Instead, it demonstrates how memory reshaped causes into culturally resonant forms. In a world where the collapse of Bronze Age institutions erased administrative records, narrative tradition filled explanatory gaps with moral causation. The abduction of Helen provided a coherent story that linked cause, action, and consequence in ways that systemic explanations could not. Comparative evidence from other ancient traditions supports this pattern. Many societies explain wars through personal offenses, divine will, or broken oaths, even when underlying causes are structural. Such explanations do not describe events as they occurred, but as they were understood and justified within specific cultural frameworks. A third interpretive insight arises from this comparison. Mythic casus belli narratives serve as mnemonic devices. They preserve the memory of conflict while simplifying its origins, ensuring transmission across generations even as factual detail erodes. The persistence of the Hellen narrative across centuries indicates its effectiveness. It provided a stable explanatory core that could accommodate variation in detail while maintaining coherence. This stability allowed later historians and poets to situate the Trojan War within a recognizable moral universe. From a historical standpoint, the mythic cause should not be read as evidence of the war's origin, but as evidence of how Greeks interpreted conflict and obligation. It reveals the values that shaped remembrance rather than the mechanisms that initiated hostilities. By the time these stories were recorded, the systemic causes of late Bronze Age conflict, trade competition, diplomatic failure, and frontier instability had been transformed into a personal narrative of honor violated and honor restored. War moved from cause to action, transitioning from structural tension into remembered confrontation within the epic tradition. The expedition required unprecedented coordination. In the late Bronze Age Aegean, warfare on the scale imagined by later tradition could not be sustained by a single polity acting alone. Any major overseas campaign depended on the ability of multiple Mycenaean kingdoms to align leadership, mobilize resources, and coordinate maritime logistics across long distances. Whether or not the Trojan War occurred exactly as remembered, the organizational requirements described in epic tradition reflect real capabilities that had emerged within Mycenaean Greece by the 13th century BCE. Mycenaean political organization was fragmented, consisting of multiple palace-centered kingdoms rather than a unified state. Sites such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and Knossos each controlled defined territories with their own administrative systems. Linear B tablets indicate that these palaces operated independently, managing land, labor, and production within localized hierarchies. There is no evidence for a permanent pan-Mycenaean authority. As a result, any large-scale expedition required negotiated cooperation among autonomous rulers. Leadership within such a coalition would have depended on status, reputation, and practical authority rather than formal sovereignty. In the Homeric tradition, Agamemnon of Mycenae appears as Wanax over other kings, reflecting Mycenae's prominence rather than institutional supremacy. Archaeological evidence supports Mycenae's exceptional wealth and fortification, suggesting it occupied a leading position among mainland centers. This prominence likely translated into influence during collective ventures, even without centralized control. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Mycenaean coalition warfare relied on hierarchical negotiation rather than command structures. Authority was situational and contingent, shaped by relative power, lineage, and the ability to supply resources. Logistical coordination formed the backbone of any expedition. Linear B tablets from Pylos provide the clearest evidence of how palaces mobilized manpower and supplies. These records list contributions of grain, livestock, textiles, and bronze allocated for specific purposes. Some tablets document the mustering of rowers and guards along the coast, indicating preparedness for maritime operations. Such administrative oversight suggests that palaces could redirect surplus toward military objectives when required. Ships were central to this mobilization. Although no Mycenaean ships survive, iconographic evidence and later descriptions suggest long, narrow vessels powered primarily by oars. The Homeric catalog of ships lists over 1,000 vessels, a figure widely regarded as poetic exaggeration. Nevertheless, archaeology indicates that Mycenaean maritime capacity was substantial. Coastal settlements, harbor installations, and island networks point to sustained seafaring activity. Even a fraction of the ships described in epic would have required extensive coordination across multiple regions. Constructing and maintaining ships demanded timber, skilled labor, and time. As discussed earlier, timber was a strategic resource, often sourced from outside the Greek mainland. Palatial control over craft specialists ensured that shipbuilding could be organized systematically. This capacity suggests that Mycenaean rulers anticipated maritime expeditions as a recurring feature of political life rather than exceptional events. Provisioning an overseas force posed additional challenges. Unlike short-distance raiding, a prolonged campaign required reliable food supply, replacement equipment, and seasonal planning. Linear B evidence indicates that palaces stored surplus grain and redistributed it as needed. Livestock inventories suggest the ability to supply meat, hides, and secondary products. While much provisioning may have relied on foraging or local extraction once abroad, initial supply capacity was essential for departure and early operations. A second interpretive insight follows. Mycenaean palaces functioned as logistical engines capable of sustaining collective action beyond their immediate territories. This capability distinguishes late Bronze Age warfare from earlier, more localized conflict. Resource extraction extended beyond material goods to human labor. Dependent populations, recorded in the tablets as workers and retainers, provided rowing power, craft production, and auxiliary support. The ability to compel or obligate communities to contribute labor reflects the coercive capacity of palace administration. This system reduced reliance on voluntary participation and enabled rulers to assemble forces at scale. Coalition warfare also required ideological cohesion. While administrative systems managed logistics, shared cultural values justified participation. Epic tradition emphasizes honor, oath-bound obligation, and collective retaliation. These themes align with what is known of elite interaction in early societies, where reputation and reciprocity reinforced alliances. Participation in a major expedition offered opportunities for prestige and spoils, reinforcing elite buy-in. However, coordination among independent rulers was inherently unstable. The Iliad itself reflects this tension through disputes over authority and distribution of rewards. While poetic, these conflicts point to real challenges in maintaining cohesion within a coalition lacking centralized enforcement. Disagreements over leadership, resource allocation, and strategic priorities could undermine unity. Archaeological patterns suggest that Mycenaean warfare often took the form of episodic expeditions rather than continuous campaigns. Burn layers at coastal Anatolian sites, combined with limited evidence of long-term occupation, indicate raids or short-term engagements rather than sustained conquest. This pattern aligns with a model in which coalition forces assembled for specific objectives and disbanded afterward. A third interpretive insight arises here. The scale of mobilization described in later tradition may represent an aggregation of multiple expeditions remembered as a single war. Coalition warfare could recur over years or decades without constituting a continuous siege. Leadership roles within the coalition were likely fluid. A leading king may have coordinated initial assembly and strategy, but operational decisions in the field would depend on consensus among elite leaders. This decentralized command structure limited efficiency but allowed flexibility. It also increased the likelihood of internal conflict, particularly as campaigns dragged on. The mobilization process itself may have taken months or years. Gathering ships, provisioning crews, and aligning political commitments required sustained effort. Seasonal constraints shaped timing, as sailing and campaigning were restricted by weather. These practical considerations challenge later depictions of rapid mobilization and suggest a more incremental buildup to conflict. By the 13th century BCE, Mycenaean Greece possessed the organizational capacity to mount coordinated overseas expeditions involving multiple polities. Palace administration, maritime infrastructure, and elite alliance networks combined to make such ventures feasible. While later epic tradition exaggerates scale and unity, the underlying mechanisms reflect real systemic capabilities. Mobilization transformed structural tension into collective action. Once assembled, coalition forces moved beyond preparation toward engagement. Mobilization led to confrontation, carrying Mycenaean power across the Aegean and into sustained contact with the Anatolian world. Troy anticipated conflict. By the late 13th century BCE, the settlement at Hazarlik had already undergone centuries of fortification, reconstruction, and political adaptation in response to its exposed position on the northwestern Anatolian coast. Archaeological evidence from Troy 6 and VIA indicates that the city was not an unprepared or marginal settlement, but a well-defended regional center whose leadership understood the realities of interstate violence in the late Bronze Age. The fortifications of Troy 6 represent one of the most substantial defensive systems in the Aegean Anatolian world. Excavations reveal massive limestone walls, in places over 5 meters thick, reinforced with towers and carefully engineered gates. These walls followed the contours of the citadel mound, creating overlapping fields of defense rather than straight, vulnerable lines. The scale and sophistication of this construction indicate centralized planning and access to significant labor resources. Archaeologists uncovered sloping stone bases topped with mud brick superstructures, a design well suited to absorb seismic shock and projectile impact. The presence of multiple gateways, including the South Gate and East Gate complexes, suggests controlled access rather than simple enclosure. These features point to an urban center designed to withstand both sudden assault and prolonged pressure. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Troy's defenses were not reactive improvisations, but the product of long-term strategic planning. This indicates sustained expectations of conflict rather than isolated threat. Beyond the citadel, Troy 6 extended into a substantial lower city. Geophysical surveys have identified ditches, walls, and habitation zones spreading well beyond the fortified Acropolis. This expanded settlement increased population capacity while also complicating defense. In response, Troy's planners incorporated outer defensive features, including a broad ditch that may have functioned as an obstacle to chariots and massed infantry. The existence of a lower city implies a significant civilian population whose protection required coordination between military and administrative authorities. This arrangement suggests that Troy's leadership anticipated not only raids but extended confrontations that would place pressure on food supply and civilian stability. Food storage formed a critical component of siege preparedness. Excavations in Troy via reveal large storage vessels embedded in house floors, often clustered within domestic spaces. These pithoi could store grain, oil, and other staples for extended periods. Their widespread presence suggests systematic stockpiling rather than ad hoc household reserves. The pattern of storage indicates anticipation of restricted access to external resources. In siege scenarios, control of surplus determined endurance. Troy's storage strategy implies centralized oversight, possibly coordinated by palace authorities or elite households responsible for redistribution during crisis. A second interpretive insight follows. The integration of storage infrastructure into domestic architecture reflects a city preparing for isolation. Siege readiness extended beyond military walls into everyday economic organization. Textual evidence from the Hittite archives provides additional context for Troy's defensive posture. Hittite documents identify Wilusa as a politically significant entity within Western Anatolia, at times aligned with or subordinate to the Hittite Great King. The Alexander Treaty, dating to approximately 1280 BCE, records a formal agreement between Wilusa's ruler and the Hittite court. Such treaties typically entailed obligations of mutual defense and recognition of borders. This diplomatic framework suggests that Troy was not isolated. In the event of external aggression, Wilusa could potentially call upon regional allies or expect diplomatic intervention. However, the same texts indicate that Western Anatolia was a zone of instability, with shifting loyalties and recurring conflict involving entities such as Aegean. Hittite correspondence, including the Manapatarhunta letter, describes unrest in the region and military actions affecting Wilusa. While these texts do not describe a specific Trojan War, they demonstrate that Troy existed within a volatile political environment where preparation for violence was rational and necessary. Regional alliances likely played a role in Troy's defensive planning. Archaeological parallels in material culture between Troy and neighboring Anatolian sites suggest participation in shared networks of exchange and obligation. Such networks could provide auxiliary manpower, intelligence, or logistical support during conflict. However, reliance on allies carried risks. Diplomatic assistance was contingent on broader geopolitical calculations. If a conflict with Mycenaean forces escalated beyond local scope, Hittite priorities elsewhere could limit effective intervention. Troy's emphasis on self-contained defenses suggests awareness of these limitations. A third interpretive insight emerges. Troy's preparation balanced diplomatic reliance with autonomous resilience. The city was embedded in alliance systems but structured its defenses to survive without immediate external relief. The transition from Troy 6 to VIA is particularly significant. Troy 6 appears to have ended abruptly, possibly due to earthquake damage, while Troy VIA shows signs of rapid reconstruction under strained conditions. Houses were smaller, more densely packed, and oriented toward maximizing storage capacity. Defensive features were repaired and reinforced, suggesting continuity of threat. Many scholars interpret Troy VIA as a phase of heightened insecurity. Burn layers, scattered weaponry, and human remains found in streets indicate violent destruction. While dating remains debated, this archaeological horizon aligns closely with traditional chronologies for a late Bronze Age conflict involving Troy. Preparation for siege also involved social adaptation. Population density increased within the walls, indicating movement from rural areas into the fortified core. Such consolidation suggests anticipation of external attack and a shift from open agricultural life to defensive urban concentration. This process would have strained resources and required administrative coordination. Ensuring equitable distribution of stored food, maintaining morale, and organizing defense rotations demanded effective leadership. Although no written records from Troy survive, the material evidence implies structured governance capable of crisis management. Defensive readiness extended to weaponry. Excavations have uncovered arrowheads, spear points, and other arms consistent with late Bronze Age warfare. The distribution of these items within the settlement suggests preparation for close-quarters defense rather than purely symbolic armament. By the late 13th century BCE, Troy had transformed into a fortified, provisioned, and politically aware city anticipating confrontation. Its walls, storage systems, and regional diplomacy formed an integrated defensive strategy shaped by decades of instability. Preparation, however, does not determine outcome. Defensive measures could delay, but not necessarily prevent, sustained external pressure. As coalition forces arrived and conflict intensified, Troy's readiness would be tested under conditions of prolonged warfare. Preparation gave way to prolonged war, as anticipation became lived reality and defensive systems faced continuous strain. Combat reflected social hierarchy. In the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, methods of fighting were closely tied to status, access to resources, and the political structures that sustained warfare. Both the Mycenaean and Anatolian worlds practiced forms of combat that emphasized elite participation, controlled violence, and ritualized display alongside practical battlefield effectiveness. Understanding these systems is essential for evaluating how conflict around Troy could unfold as a prolonged stalemate rather than a rapid conquest. Bronze Age weaponry was shaped by material constraints and technological limits. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was costly and required long-distance trade networks to sustain. As a result, weapons were valuable possessions, often restricted to elite warriors. Archaeological finds from Mycenaean shaft graves at Mycenae include swords, daggers, and spearheads decorated with precious metals, underscoring their symbolic and functional importance. Swords evolved significantly during this period. Early rapiers designed for thrusting gradually gave way to longer, heavier blades capable of cutting as well as stabbing. These later swords, such as type Naui II examples, appear across the Eastern Mediterranean by the late 13th century BCE. Their widespread distribution suggests shared technological standards and interconnected military cultures. Spears remained the primary battlefield weapon. Linear B tablets record allocations of spearheads and shafts, indicating standardized production and centralized control. Spears were versatile, effective both in formation fighting and individual combat. The prevalence of spear-based warfare aligns with iconographic depictions from frescoes and seals. Armor further reinforced social distinctions. Mycenaean panoplies included bronze helmets, greaves, and occasionally cuirasses. The most famous example, the Dendra panoply, dates to the 15th century BCE and consists of articulated bronze plates covering the torso and shoulders. While likely impractical for sustained combat, it demonstrates the extent of elite investment in personal protection. Helmets varied widely. Boar's tusk helmets, described in the Iliad and confirmed archaeologically, combined organic and bronze elements. Their construction required considerable labor, reinforcing their association with high-status warriors. Such equipment was not issued broadly, but concentrated among a narrow military aristocracy. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Bronze Age combat systems privileged elite survivability and visibility over mass participation. Warfare was an arena for demonstrating status as much as achieving tactical objectives. Chariots played a prominent role in late Bronze Age warfare, though their function remains debated. Hittite and Egyptian sources depict chariots as mobile platforms for archers or javelin throwers. In the Aegean context, linear B tablets list chariot components, wheels, and horses, indicating organized maintenance and storage. However, the terrain around Troy limits the effectiveness of chariots in close siege conditions. While chariots could operate on plains and roads, they were less useful in broken or confined landscapes. This suggests their primary role may have been rapid transport of elite warriors to and from the battlefield rather than direct engagement. Infantry formed the bulk of any fighting force. Equipped with spears, shields, and minimal armor, these soldiers likely included retainers, dependents, and levied personnel. Shields, often made of hide over wood, varied in shape and size. Figure-8 and tower shields appear in Aegean art, though their exact use remains uncertain. Battlefield behavior combined formation fighting with individual duels. Homeric descriptions of single combat reflect a tradition of elite engagement that coexisted with massed action. While epic exaggerates personal heroics, the emphasis on champions may preserve a memory of limited-scale encounters where elite fighters influenced morale and outcome. A second interpretive insight follows. Tactical emphasis on elite combat may have constrained the scale and decisiveness of engagements. When warfare prioritized individual prestige, prolonged stalemate became more likely than rapid annihilation. Siege warfare in the Bronze Age was technically limited. Without advanced siege engines, attackers relied on blockade, attrition, and opportunistic assault. Defenders, protected by walls and elevated positions, held significant advantages. Attempts to breach fortifications required sustained pressure, coordination, and time. Missile weapons played a crucial role in siege contexts. Archaeological finds at Hizarlik include numerous arrowheads, suggesting repeated exchanges of projectile fire. Archers could harass defenders on walls or target attackers approaching gates. However, limited range and accuracy reduced the likelihood of decisive breakthroughs. Close-quarters fighting occurred primarily during sorties or attempted breaches. Such engagements were dangerous and often indecisive. The lack of standardized drill or discipline among large infantry formations further limited offensive effectiveness. Psychological factors also shape tactics. Display of armor, weapons, and numbers served to intimidate opponents and assert dominance. Ritual challenges, insults, and demonstrations of bravery reinforced social hierarchies and tested resolve. These practices, while culturally significant, consumed time and resources. Comparative evidence from Hittite military texts suggests that campaigns were often seasonal and episodic. Armies assembled, conducted operations, and disbanded according to agricultural cycles. This pattern aligns with the idea of intermittent fighting around Troy rather than continuous siege. A third interpretive insight arises. Seasonal warfare rhythms and logistical limits reinforced stalemate conditions. Neither side possessed the capacity for uninterrupted pressure over extended periods. The interaction of these factors, elite-focused combat, limited siege technology, and logistical constraints, shaped the character of warfare during the Late Bronze Age. Battles could be fierce but localized, and sieges prolonged without decisive resolution. As a result, conflict around Troy likely consisted of repeated confrontations, raids, and defensive engagements rather than a single, continuous assault. Tactical realities constrained strategic outcomes, producing a prolonged struggle shaped by technology and social structure. Tactics shaped stalemate. The methods available to Bronze Age armies favored endurance over resolution, setting the conditions for a conflict measured in years rather than days. Archaeology records an abrupt end. At Hizarlik, the material evidence preserved in the destruction of Troy via provides the clearest physical anchor for evaluating whether a late Bronze Age conflict culminated in catastrophic violence. While archaeology cannot confirm literary narratives, it can document patterns of damage, abandonment, and disruption consistent with large-scale warfare around the turn of the 12th century BCE. Troy via represents the final major Bronze Age occupation of the site. Stratigraphic analysis dates its destruction to approximately 1190 BCE, though margins of error remain. This horizon is characterized by widespread burning, collapsed architecture, and human remains found within the settlement. These features distinguish Troy via from earlier phases and indicate a violent end rather than gradual decline. Excavations reveal that many buildings were destroyed by fire. Charred timbers, ash layers, and heat-altered stone appear across the citadel and lower city. Fire was not confined to a single structure but affected multiple zones, suggesting an event of significant scale. Accidental fire cannot be ruled out in isolation, but the spatial distribution supports a more destructive scenario. Human remains discovered within the destruction layer add further context. In several cases, skeletons were found in streets or collapsed buildings, indicating sudden death without formal burial. Some remains show signs of trauma consistent with violence. While sample sizes are limited, these findings align with patterns observed at other sites destroyed during warfare. A first interpretive insight emerges here. The combination of fire, structural collapse, and unburied remains points toward a sudden and disruptive event, rather than orderly evacuation. Such signatures are commonly associated with violent destruction in late Bronze Age contexts. The architectural character of Troy via strengthens this interpretation. As discussed earlier, the settlement shows evidence of crowding and defensive adaptation prior to destruction. Houses were densely packed, and storage vessels were embedded in floors, suggesting preparation for siege conditions. The destruction of such a settlement implies that defensive measures ultimately failed. Weapon finds within the destruction layer further support a conflict scenario. Arrowheads, spear points, and sling stones have been recovered in contexts associated with Troy via. Their presence within residential areas suggests fighting penetrated the city rather than remaining outside the walls. However, archaeology alone cannot identify attackers. Material culture does not preserve ethnic labels, and weapons used by Mycenaean and Anatolian forces were broadly similar. This limitation requires cautious interpretation. The destruction of Troy via demonstrates violence, but not its perpetrators. Comparative analysis with other late Bronze Age sites provides important perspective. Destruction layers dated to the same general period appear at Mycenaean centers such as Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae, as well as at Anatolian and Levantine sites. This widespread pattern suggests regional instability rather than isolated catastrophe. A second interpretive insight follows. Troy's destruction occurred within a broader horizon of systemic collapse. Warfare, internal unrest, and external pressures converged across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Abandonment patterns at Troy further clarify the sequence of events. Following the destruction of via, the site shows a marked reduction in occupation. Later phases are sparse and lack the complexity of earlier urban organization. This gap indicates that the city did not immediately recover its former status, supporting the idea of a decisive break. Environmental and economic factors likely compounded the effects of violence. Disruption of trade networks, loss of population, and damage to agricultural infrastructure would have hindered recovery. Even if Troy had survived militarily, these stresses could have undermined long-term viability. The relationship between Troy via and literary tradition remains debated. Some scholars argue that the archaeological horizon corresponds broadly with ancient chronologies for the Trojan War, such as the date proposed by Eratosthenes. Others caution against direct correlation, noting that multiple destruction events occurred at Hizarlik over centuries. A third interpretive insight arises from this debate. Archaeology provides constraints, not confirmation. The destruction of Troy via establishes a plausible historical context for remembered conflict, but does not validate specific narrative details. The nature of the destruction also raises questions about method. Fire could result from assault, accidental spread during fighting, or post-conquest looting. The lack of evidence for systematic rebuilding suggests that whatever occurred disrupted social and political continuity beyond repair. Importantly, Troy via was not rebuilt as a major center after its destruction. This contrasts with earlier phases where recovery followed catastrophe. The finality of this abandonment marks the end of Troy's Bronze Age prominence. In evaluating destruction layers, historians must balance material evidence with interpretive restraint. The archaeological record at Hizarlik demonstrates that Troy experienced violent destruction around 1190 BCE. It also shows that this event occurred during a period of widespread regional upheaval. Archaeology thus anchors the Trojan War tradition within a real horizon of collapse, without resolving questions of agency or narrative detail. What can be stated with confidence is that Troy's end was abrupt, violent, and transformative. Collapse extended beyond Troy. The destruction of the city formed part of a broader unraveling of late Bronze Age systems, setting the stage for regional transformation and the end of an era. The most famous episode may be least literal. Among all elements of the Trojan War tradition, none has exerted greater influence on later imagination than the story of the wooden horse. As preserved in later Greek and Roman literature, the episode describes a deceptive stratagem through which Greek forces gained entry into Troy. From a historical perspective, however, the episode demands careful analysis, not as a factual account, but as a layered tradition shaped by symbolism, metaphor, and retrospective interpretation. The earliest surviving reference to the wooden horse appears not in Homer's Iliad, which ends before Troy's fall, but in later epic cycles and the Odyssey. In Book 8 of the Odyssey, the poet alludes briefly to the horse as a known episode, suggesting that the story circulated widely by the 8th century BCE. Full narrative elaboration appears later, most notably in Virgil's Aeneid, composed in the 1st century BCE. This chronological distance underscores the interpretive challenge. The account emerges centuries after the supposed events. In its canonical form, the wooden horse functions as an instrument of deception. Greek forces feign retreat, leaving behind a large wooden structure ostensibly dedicated to Athena. Trojan debate over the object's meaning and fate becomes central to the story. Ultimately, the horse is brought inside the city, allowing concealed warriors to open the gates. The city falls not through force, but through misjudgment. From an analytical standpoint, this narrative reflects cultural values rather than military documentation. Greek epic tradition often privileges intelligence and cunning alongside martial prowess. Figures such as Odysseus embody this dual ideal. The horse episode elevates strategic deception into a decisive virtue, contrasting endurance warfare with clever resolution. A first interpretive insight emerges here. The wooden horse operates as a moral and intellectual symbol, emphasizing Métis, strategic intelligence, as a legitimate instrument of victory within Greek thought. Several historical interpretations have been proposed to explain the tradition's possible origins. One approach treats the horse as symbolic language rather than literal structure. In this reading, horse may refer metaphorically to siege machinery. Later Greek and Near Eastern sources use animal terminology to describe war engines, including battering rams and mobile towers. Such devices, constructed of wood, could plausibly be remembered as a horse associated with destruction. However, archaeological evidence does not confirm the use of complex siege engines at Troy during the Late Bronze Age. As discussed earlier, siege technology remained limited. This weakens the likelihood of a direct mechanical referent, though it does not eliminate symbolic reinterpretation by later audiences. Another interpretation associates the horse with seismic activity. Troy 6 shows signs of earthquake damage, and the horse was closely linked to Poseidon, god of earthquakes as well as horses. Some scholars suggest that the tradition preserves a memory of destruction attributed to divine or natural forces, later rationalized into narrative form. In this model, the horse represents seismic collapse rather than military trickery. A second interpretive insight follows. The horse tradition may encode environmental or catastrophic memory transformed into culturally intelligible narrative. Such transformations are common in oral traditions spanning centuries. A third line of interpretation emphasizes ritual symbolism. Horses held significant religious meaning in the Bronze Age Aegean and Anatolia, often associated with elite status, sacrifice, and divine favor. A large wooden horse could symbolize ritual offering, violation of taboo, or divine deception. The Trojan decision to bring the object into the city becomes a narrative explanation for divine withdrawal or punishment. From this perspective, the episode explains not how Troy fell mechanically, but why it fell morally. The city's destruction is framed as the result of impiety, error, or misinterpretation of signs. This aligns with broader epic patterns in which divine favor determines outcomes. Importantly, none of these interpretations require the horse to have existed as described. Oral traditions often compress complex events into singular symbolic acts. A prolonged conflict ending in sudden destruction would naturally invite a dramatic explanation emphasizing reversal and surprise. Comparative evidence reinforces this pattern. Many ancient cultures explain city falls through deception narratives, betrayal motifs, or ritual violation. These stories function as explanatory frameworks that reconcile endurance with sudden collapse. From a historical methodological standpoint, the wooden horse tradition cannot be treated as evidence for a specific tactic. Its late attestation, symbolic density, and narrative function place it firmly within mythic historiography rather than contemporaneous record. A third interpretive insight arises from this limitation. The horse story reveals how later societies sought narrative closure for unresolved endurance warfare. When prolonged conflict ends abruptly, memory demands explanation. What remains historically credible is not the method, but the outcome. Archaeological evidence confirms Troy's destruction by violent means around the turn of the 12th century BCE. Whether through assault, internal collapse, or cumulative attrition, the city fell. The horse tradition thus operates as a narrative bridge between endurance and collapse. It provides a coherent mechanism through which stalemate gives way to resolution, satisfying cultural expectations of causality. For historians, the value of the wooden horse lies not in reconstructing battlefield tactics, but in understanding how Bronze Age conflict was remembered, moralized, and transmitted. It demonstrates the power of symbolic storytelling to preserve historical rupture when factual detail is lost. Regardless of method, Troy fell. The tradition of the horse marks the transition from prolonged warfare to irreversible destruction, closing the conflict and opening a new historical phase shaped by collapse and transformation. Victory brought devastation. In the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, the capture of a fortified city rarely resulted in orderly transition. Instead, sack marked the culmination of prolonged conflict through destruction, displacement, and irreversible disruption. At Troy, archaeological evidence and comparative historical patterns indicate that the city's fall was followed by widespread devastation that reshaped both local and regional dynamics. The immediate phase following breach or collapse typically involved systematic looting and burning. Archaeological layers at Troy VIA show extensive fire damage across residential and administrative areas. Such burning served multiple functions. It neutralized remaining resistance, destroyed economic infrastructure, and symbolized the termination of political authority. Fire also limited the possibility of rapid reoccupation by surviving inhabitants. Material culture within the destruction layer reflects abrupt abandonment. Household goods were left in place, storage vessels shattered or charred, and tools scattered. These patterns indicate sudden disruption rather than planned evacuation. In several cases, valuables appear to have been removed, suggesting selective looting prior to or during the city's destruction. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Sack functioned as both military conclusion and political statement. Destruction communicated finality, ensuring that the defeated center could not easily reconstitute its authority. Population displacement followed immediately. Survivors of the sack likely fled or were forcibly removed. Late Bronze Age warfare commonly involved enslavement and deportation, practices well documented in Hittite and Egyptian sources. Captured populations were valuable as labor and symbolic trophies, reinforcing the victor's status. At Troy, the archaeological record shows a sharp decline in occupation after VIA. Later phases are sparse, indicating that the urban population did not return at scale. This absence supports a model of large-scale displacement rather than temporary abandonment. The social consequences of displacement were profound. Loss of population disrupted agricultural cycles, craft production, and local governance. Even if some inhabitants remained in the surrounding region, the collapse of urban coordination effectively dissolved Troy's role as a political center. Economic repercussions extended beyond the city itself. Troy's position near the Dardanelles meant its destruction affected control of regional trade corridors. Disruption of toll collection, harbor activity, and exchange networks would have altered patterns of movement between the Aegean and Black Sea regions. A second interpretive insight follows. The sack of Troy had systemic economic consequences disproportionate to the city's size. Strategic nodes amplify the impact of their removal from networked systems. Comparative evidence from other late Bronze Age sites reinforces this interpretation. The destruction of Ugarit similarly resulted in abandonment and long-term economic decline. In both cases, cities that functioned as intermediaries suffered cascading effects when removed from circulation. For the attackers, victory did not necessarily translate into lasting control. Archaeological evidence does not indicate Mycenaean colonization of Troy immediately after its fall. Instead, the region entered a period of fragmentation and reduced complexity. This outcome reflects the limitations of coalition warfare, which prioritized destruction over administration. Loot acquired during the sack may have contributed to short-term enrichment of individual leaders, but it did not sustain long-term dominance. The absence of organized replacement governance suggests that the attackers lacked either the capacity or incentive to occupy and manage the territory. A third interpretive insight arises. Sack resolved conflict through negation rather than integration. The goal was elimination of opposition, not incorporation of territory. Psychological consequences also merit consideration. The destruction of a major fortified city served as a deterrent and warning within regional power systems. Such acts reinforced norms of retaliation and demonstrated the costs of prolonged resistance. However, they also perpetuated cycles of violence by embedding grievance and instability. In the broader cultural memory, sack became a defining element of the Trojan War tradition. Later narratives emphasize brutality, betrayal, and suffering, reflecting enduring awareness of the destructive climax. While these accounts are literary, they echo the archaeological reality of abrupt urban termination. Immediately following Troy's fall, the region entered a transitional phase. Trade routes adjusted, populations redistributed, and political alignments shifted. These changes did not occur in isolation but coincided with wider late Bronze Age disruptions affecting Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant. The sack thus represents not an endpoint, but a catalyst. Its consequences extended beyond the city walls, contributing to regional instability and transformation. Troy ceased to function as a Bronze Age power, and its absence reshaped interactions among surviving communities. Victory brought devastation not only to the defeated, but to the systems that had sustained the conflict. Consequences rippled outward, carrying the impact of Troy's fall into the broader collapse that followed across the eastern Mediterranean. Troy fell amid a collapsing world. The destruction of Troy via IA around the end of the 13th century BCE did not occur in isolation, but within a broader sequence of failures that affected nearly every major political and economic system of the eastern Mediterranean. This period, commonly referred to as the Late Bronze Age crisis, witnessed the rapid disintegration of palace-based states, long-distance trade networks, and diplomatic systems that had endured for centuries. By approximately 1200 BCE, several of the region's most powerful states had collapsed or were in terminal decline. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated much of Anatolia, ceased to function as a centralized authority. Excavations at Hattusa reveal widespread destruction, abandonment of administrative centers, and the disappearance of cuneiform record-keeping. Royal correspondence abruptly ends, indicating systemic failure rather than dynastic transition. The fall of the Hittite state removed a stabilizing force from western Anatolia. Wilusa, identified with Troy in Hittite texts, had existed within this imperial framework as a vassal or allied kingdom. With Hittite authority gone, the political vacuum exposed regional centers to intensified conflict and insecurity. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Troy's destruction must be understood as part of a cascading collapse rather than a singular cause or effect. The loss of imperial oversight amplified local conflicts and reduced opportunities for diplomatic mediation. Simultaneously, Mycenaean Greece experienced widespread palace destruction. Archaeological layers at Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, and Thebes show evidence of burning and abandonment dated to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Linear B administration ceased, indicating the collapse of centralized bureaucratic systems that had organized labor, production, and military mobilization. These destructions were not uniform or simultaneous, suggesting multiple stressors rather than a single invasion. In some cases, internal revolt, resource scarcity, or seismic activity may have contributed. Nevertheless, the result was systemic. The end of palace economies and the fragmentation of political authority across the Greek mainland. In the eastern Mediterranean, coastal cities faced additional pressures. Egyptian records from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe incursions by groups collectively labeled the Sea Peoples. These texts depict migrations and attacks affecting Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt itself. While Egyptian sources emphasize military victory, archaeological evidence indicates that many regions suffered lasting disruption. A second interpretive insight follows. The Sea Peoples likely represent a symptom rather than a cause of collapse. Population movement, driven by instability elsewhere, intensified existing vulnerabilities rather than initiating them. Trade networks that sustained Bronze Age economies disintegrated under these pressures. The Ulubran shipwreck, dated to the late 14th century BCE, illustrates the complexity and reach of these networks at their height. By the early 12th century BCE, such long-distance exchange had largely ceased. Tin, essential for bronze production, became scarce, undermining military and economic systems. The collapse of trade had cascading effects. Specialized craft production declined, urban populations shrank, and technological regression occurred in some regions. Without surplus redistribution, palatial authority eroded, leaving communities more localized and less interconnected. Environmental factors compounded these challenges. Paleoclimatic data suggests periods of drought affecting parts of the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th century BCE. Reduced agricultural yields would have strained food supplies, increased competition, and heightened the impact of conflict. While not determinative alone, environmental stress amplified systemic fragility. A third interpretive insight arises. Late Bronze Age systems were highly interconnected and therefore highly vulnerable. When trade, diplomacy, and governance failed simultaneously, collapse propagated rapidly across regions. Troy's position within this network made it particularly susceptible. As a gateway between the Aegean and Black Sea, its prosperity depended on stability. When regional order disintegrated, Troy lost both protection and relevance. Its destruction thus reflects both localized conflict and systemic breakdown. The cumulative effect of these collapses was demographic and cultural transformation. Populations migrated, cities were abandoned, and new forms of social organization emerged. Writing systems disappeared in some regions, including Greece, marking a transition to the so-called Dark Age. Importantly, collapse did not mean total depopulation or cultural erasure. Communities adapted by decentralizing, relying on subsistence economies, and forming smaller political units. However, the scale and complexity of Bronze Age civilization were not immediately recovered. The late Bronze Age crisis reframes the Trojan War tradition. Rather than a singular heroic conflict, it becomes one episode within a period of systemic failure. Memory preserved the war because it marked a threshold, the end of an era. Troy fell amid a collapsing world, not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a broader unraveling. Survivors carried memory forward, transmitting stories of conflict and loss into the fragmented societies that followed. The end reshaped societies. The collapse of Troy and surrounding late Bronze Age polities precipitated profound demographic and cultural changes across the Aegean and Anatolia. As centralized authority and palace economies disintegrated, populations migrated, settlements were abandoned, and social structures transformed. This period marks the transition from the complex, literate societies of the late Bronze Age to the more localized, often non-literate communities of the early Iron Age. Population movement was extensive and multifaceted. Archaeological evidence indicates both voluntary migration and forced displacement. Sites abandoned during the 12th century BCE, such as Troy via Pylos, and Mycenae, suggest that communities relocated to safer or more productive areas. Some of these migrations followed river valleys, coastlines, or defensible inland regions, where smaller polities could reorganize without relying on centralized control. These movements were not uniform but involved multiple layers of mobility. Elite families may have sought refuge with allies or retained influence in secondary centers, while lower status groups dispersed into rural hinterlands. In some cases, migration involved trans-Aegean movement, contributing to the spread of material culture, linguistic elements, and technological practices into newly settled regions. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Migration during the late Bronze Age collapse functioned as both survival strategy and vector for cultural transformation. Population redistribution facilitated the diffusion of practices while simultaneously fracturing existing political networks. The disruption of writing systems exemplifies the broader cultural consequences. Linear B, used extensively for administrative and economic purposes in Mycenaean Greece, ceased to be employed following palace destruction. The disappearance of bureaucratic literacy indicates the collapse of centralized control and the end of palace-centered economic management. Without writing, the transmission of detailed administrative knowledge became oral, fragmentary, and localized. Material culture, architecture, and ritual practice carried cultural memory, but systematic record-keeping was largely lost. In turn, societies transitioned to forms of social organization that relied on local leadership, kinship networks, and community-based resource management. Economic transformations accompanied these social shifts. Long-distance trade networks that had linked the Aegean, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt largely dissolved. The Eluberan shipwreck, dating to the late 14th century BCE, represents the pinnacle of such commerce. By the early Iron Age, comparable exchanges had diminished significantly. Local economies became more self-sufficient, emphasizing subsistence agriculture, pastoralism, and small-scale craft production. Technological change also followed collapse. While bronze remained in use, scarcity of tin and copper facilitated the gradual adoption of iron tools and weapons. Early Iron Age metallurgy reflects both continuity and adaptation, as communities restructured production to match local resource availability and social needs. A second interpretive insight follows. Systemic collapse did not entail uniform technological regression, but a selective realignment. Societies retained critical practices while innovating to cope with resource constraints and decentralized governance. Ritual and religious practices also transformed. Palatial cults, often tied to centralized authority, diminished or disappeared, while localized shrines and ancestor veneration became more prominent. Iconographic continuity persists in some regions, but large-scale monumental expression declines. This shift reflects a redistribution of spiritual authority alongside political decentralization. The cumulative effect of population movement, economic realignment, and ritual transformation reshaped social hierarchies. The warrior elite structures characteristic of Mycenaean Greece were replaced by smaller-scale aristocracies or community leadership. In Anatolia, former Hittite administrative centers were abandoned, and new polities emerged with distinct local character. These transformations set the stage for the formation of early Iron Age states. Although smaller and less centralized, these societies preserved elements of late Bronze Age material culture, strategic knowledge, and urban memory. Sites such as Lefkandi in Euboea exemplify continuity amid disruption. Monumental architecture, burial practices, and imported goods indicate connections to pre-collapse traditions while reflecting the realities of a changed social landscape. A third interpretive insight emerges. Continuity and innovation coexisted, producing hybridized societies that retained memory of former complexity while adapting to a more fragmented world. The broader Eastern Mediterranean experienced parallel processes. In the Levant and Cyprus, cities experienced population shifts and reduced trade intensity, though local cultural resilience preserved ritual and craft traditions. In Egypt, the 20th dynasty confronted Sea Peoples' incursions and internal pressures, reflecting regional interdependence and vulnerability. The transformations in settlement, economy, and ritual created conditions in which memory increasingly supplanted contemporary record. Oral tradition became the primary vehicle for preserving narratives of conflict, leadership, and communal identity. Stories of Troy, Mycenaean heroism, and war were transmitted across generations, eventually crystallizing into the epic cycles known to Homeric and later Greek audiences. By framing the late Bronze Age collapse as both destructive and generative, it becomes clear that the end of Troy via IA and associated polities initiated a long-term cultural realignment. Population redistribution, loss of administrative literacy, and adaptation to decentralized life created the foundations for early Iron Age societies. These communities carried forward selective practices, preserved memory, and eventually participated in the codification of oral traditions that would define Mediterranean historiography for centuries. Consequently, while Troy ceased to function as a political and economic hub, its destruction became emblematic of systemic change. Survivors, migrants, and neighboring communities contributed to the diffusion of cultural memory and the reorganization of social, economic, and technological systems across the region. Memory replaced record. The physical collapse of institutions, the disappearance of writing, and the redistribution of populations shifted the preservation of knowledge from documentary evidence to oral narrative and material culture. This transition set the stage for centuries in which history and legend interwove, ensuring that the events surrounding Troy remained influential, even as contemporaneous administrative records vanished. The war survived through song. In the centuries following the collapse of Troy and the late Bronze Age polities, the absence of written administrative records created a vacuum in which memory depended on oral transmission. Across the Aegean, oral storytelling became the primary vehicle for preserving historical events, heroic deeds, and social values. Bardic tradition maintained continuity between the Bronze Age past and emerging early Iron Age communities, allowing knowledge of conflict, geography, and leadership to persist even as formal literacy vanished. Oral preservation relied on a combination of mnemonic structure, formulaic language, and performance. Poets, or awadoi, employed repeated phrases, epithets, and standardized scenes to aid recall. Homeric formulas, such as recurring descriptions of armor, ships, or heroic traits, reflect a practical system designed to stabilize long narrative sequences across generations. These structures enabled the retention of large bodies of story while allowing flexibility for adaptation and regional variation. Performance was central to transmission. Bards recited or sang narratives in communal contexts, festivals, assemblies, and religious gatherings, reinforcing social cohesion and shared cultural knowledge. The performative aspect ensured that the war's memory remained socially salient, shaping collective identity and values. Audience interaction could influence emphasis, ordering, or interpretation, resulting in dynamic rather than fixed narratives. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Oral preservation functioned as a form of institutional memory. In the absence of written record, repeated performance and mnemonic structure maintained continuity and stabilized knowledge across generations, enabling the retention of historically anchored events. The content of these oral traditions preserved core elements of Bronze Age experience. References to chariot warfare, fortified citadels, and elite warrior culture suggest continuity with material and textual evidence from the Late Bronze Age. For instance, descriptions of boars' tusk helmets, palace-gathered forces, and maritime expeditions parallel archaeological finds at Mycenaean centers and Troy. These echoes indicate that bardic memory retained significant historical detail even as narrative form evolved. Regional variation influenced how stories were transmitted. Communities in mainland Greece, Ionia, and the Aegean Islands each emphasized aspects relevant to local identity or political circumstances. Localized oral traditions contributed to a multiplicity of versions, all tracing back to a shared historical substrate. This process explains inconsistencies in later literary cycles while preserving coherence at the level of cultural memory. A second interpretive insight follows. The oral medium allowed selective preservation, emphasizing social values and culturally significant events rather than exhaustive chronological accuracy. Memory was organized according to relevance, heroism, and moral lessons rather than modern historiographical standards. The process of oral preservation also integrated mythic and historical elements. Heroes became emblematic of social ideals, cities of strategic importance acquired symbolic weight, and episodes of conflict were narrated through the lens of human agency, divine intervention, and moral causality. The combination of factual memory and interpretive framing ensured that stories remained compelling while encoding social norms. Evidence for this continuity emerges indirectly through later texts. The Homeric epics, composed in the 8th century BCE, reflect deep structural familiarity with late Bronze Age society. Details of palatial organization, armament, and maritime logistics align with archaeological and textual records predating the epics by several centuries. Such alignment demonstrates that oral preservation retained historically significant knowledge, even if adapted for poetic form. The training of bards further enhanced fidelity. Apprenticeship and repeated performance created a professionalized knowledge network. Skillful recitation required memorization of extensive narrative sequences and mastery of formulaic language. Errors were corrected through communal reinforcement, creating a resilient system for knowledge transmission. A third interpretive insight arises. Oral traditions functioned as both cultural memory and educational infrastructure. They transmitted not only stories of conflict but also embedded understanding of social organization, geography, and leadership, providing continuity across generations. The oral system also accommodated change. New political realities, cultural influences, and audience expectations could be incorporated without erasing core memory. As communities shifted in the early Iron Age, the bardic repertoire adapted, preserving foundational narratives while maintaining relevance. This adaptability ensured the survival of stories like the Trojan War even in contexts far removed from the original events. Geography played a role in the preservation of oral tradition. Isolated or strategically located communities retained unique narrative variations, while trade and migration facilitated cross-regional transmission. In this way, memory of the war spread widely, establishing a shared cultural substrate that linked formerly disconnected regions of the Aegean and Anatolia. Finally, oral preservation set the stage for literary codification. By the 8th century BCE, the accumulation of stable narrative patterns, mnemonic structures, and communal recognition enabled the transition from performative song to fixed written literature. Epic narratives like the Iliad and Odyssey emerged as crystallizations of centuries of oral transmission, blending historical memory, mythic interpretation, and literary craft. Song became literature. The work of bards ensured that the Trojan War remained culturally salient, preserving knowledge that would inform historical consciousness, identity formation, and subsequent literary tradition. In this sense, oral preservation acted as both a repository of memory and a bridge to written historiography, translating the lived and remembered experience of the Bronze Age into enduring epic form. Homer unified memory. By the 8th century BCE, centuries after the fall of Troy and the collapse of Bronze Age polities, oral traditions had coalesced into structured narratives that reflected both historical memory and evolving cultural values. The epics attributed to Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey, served as the first extensive literary preservation of these stories, shaping a pan-Hellenic consciousness and providing a shared framework for understanding the past. Homeric composition was more than literary exercise. It functioned as a vehicle for collective identity. By organizing diverse oral traditions into cohesive narratives, the epics created a common repertoire of heroes, cities, and events. This process facilitated cultural cohesion among Greek-speaking communities that were politically fragmented in the early Iron Age. Citizens from mainland Greece, Ionia, and the Aegean Islands could recognize and reference the same network of heroes, places, and values, fostering a sense of shared heritage. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Homer's epics were foundational in converting localized memory into pan-Hellenic identity. By providing standardized narratives, the epics enabled communities separated by geography and politics to access a common historical and moral framework. The epics highlight social ideals central to Greek identity. Heroic conduct, adherence to honor codes, and the negotiation of individual ambition with collective obligation are recurrent themes. Characters such as Agamemnon, Achilles, and Hector exemplify these principles, offering models of leadership, courage, and ethical constraint. These portrayals reinforced communal norms and transmitted social expectations to successive generations. Homer's work also codified memory in chronological and geographic terms. References to Mycenaean citadels, Aegean landscapes, and Anatolian settlements reflect awareness of the late Bronze Age world. Details preserved in the epics, fortifications, chariot warfare, and maritime expeditions align with archaeological and textual evidence, demonstrating that memory retained historically grounded information. In this way, Homer bridged the gap between vanished political realities and contemporary cultural identity. The epic's unifying function extended beyond narrative content to ritual and performance. Public recitation of Homeric poetry at festivals, athletic competitions, and communal gatherings reinforced recognition of shared heroes and events. Such performances were integral to education, civic participation, and the maintenance of social cohesion, embedding the Trojan War and associated narratives into everyday cultural life. A second interpretive insight follows. Literary codification amplified the societal impact of memory. While oral transmission preserved information across generations, writing allowed for standardization, repeatable reference, and broader dissemination, solidifying pan-Hellenic awareness. Homeric epics also mediated the relationship between myth and history. By integrating symbolic, moral, and narrative elements, the poems provided a framework for understanding the past in ways intelligible to early Iron Age audiences. While historical precision was secondary to narrative coherence, the epics preserved traces of Bronze Age geopolitical, social, and military realities. This dual function of preservation and interpretation allowed later generations to access a remembered past while extracting meaning relevant to their present circumstances. The epics influenced political consciousness as well. By narrating conflicts like the Trojan War, Homer implicitly modeled interstate relations, leadership challenges, and coalition dynamics. Communities could reference these examples in negotiating alliances, adjudicating disputes, or legitimizing authority. The epics thus contributed to social memory not only as cultural artifact but as practical guide for navigating political realities. A third interpretive insight emerges. Homer shaped historical consciousness. Pan-Hellenic identity was reinforced through shared understanding of heroic precedent, moral expectation, and geopolitical memory, enabling collective memory to influence social and political behavior. Furthermore, Homeric texts served as loci for negotiation of cultural boundaries. By portraying both Greeks, Achaeans, and Anatolian populations, Trojans, The narratives established categories of insider and outsider, hero and opponent. These distinctions informed emerging conceptions of ethnic and regional identity, situating communities within a wider Mediterranean context while reinforcing internal cohesion. Homer's unifying influence persisted over centuries. The epics became central to education, performance, and literary tradition. Commentators and historians, from Herodotus to later Hellenistic scholars, relied on Homer as a primary reference for understanding the Late Bronze Age, even while distinguishing myth from historical fact. The authority of the epics in shaping collective memory was unmatched in Greek antiquity. The narrative's structural features also reinforced their role in identity formation. Repetition, formulaic language, and thematic continuity enabled audiences to internalize core values and historical memory efficiently. These mnemonic strategies ensured that stories of the Trojan War were not merely entertaining but cognitively and socially integrated, facilitating intergenerational transmission. Finally, Homer's work created a template for linking past and present. By framing Bronze Age conflict within coherent moral, social, and political structures, the epics allowed early Iron Age Greeks to interpret their own fragmented societies in relation to a remembered past. The Trojan War became a shared reference point, a symbol of collective experience, and a foundation for cultural self-understanding. Memory influenced power. Homeric codification transformed diffuse oral tradition into a tool for social cohesion, political legitimacy, and cultural education. The Trojan War, preserved and structured through epic, provided a shared historical consciousness that informed community norms, leadership expectations, and interregional awareness. In this way, the epics cemented the war's significance not as isolated legend but as a central component of Greek identity. Troy legitimized authority. In the centuries following Homer, the memory of the Trojan War continued to exert significant cultural and political influence across the Greek world. City-states, rulers, and military leaders invoked Trojan heritage to assert legitimacy, reinforce civic identity, and connect contemporary power to a heroic past. The Trojan narrative became a versatile instrument, employed both to unify populations and to validate claims of precedence, ancestry, or military competence. Sparta offers a primary example of such political appropriation. Spartan elites traced their mythic lineage in part to Dorian migrations from regions associated with Homeric tradition. The Trojan narrative provided a framework in which martial valor, disciplined hierarchy, and collective obligation were linked to ancestral precedent. Ritual commemoration, epic recitation, and symbolic association with the war reinforced civic ideology, aligning contemporary Spartan governance with the enduring values of the heroic age. Athens similarly engaged with Trojan legacy, albeit in a more complex fashion. Athenian narratives emphasized both cultural memory and competitive distinction. While not claiming direct descent from Trojan adversaries, Athenians highlighted roles in post-war migration narratives or intermediary mediation, emphasizing civic wisdom and strategic intelligence. Epic reinterpretation allowed Athens to assert cultural prominence while engaging with Pan-Hellenic memory, situating the city as an inheritor of historical and moral authority. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Mythic memory operated as a political instrument. By embedding contemporary identity within a shared narrative of Bronze Age heroism, Greek city-states could legitimize authority and reinforce civic cohesion, even centuries after the events themselves. The use of Troy as a legitimizing symbol extended to individual leaders. Alexander the Great, for instance, traced his ancestry to Heracles and, through him, to connections with the Trojan epic tradition. This linkage provided both divine sanction and heroic precedent, framing military campaigns as a continuation of epic precedent. By associating his conquests with Trojan memory, Alexander cultivated a narrative of historical inevitability, valor, and rightful dominion. The integration of Trojan heritage into political and military rhetoric demonstrates the adaptability of epic memory. Leaders and states selectively emphasized aspects of the narrative, lineage, strategic acumen, martial valor, to suit specific ideological or propagandistic goals. This process illustrates the enduring utility of myth as both cultural memory and active political tool. Literary and performative reinforcement played a complementary role. Epic recitations, public festivals, and educational curricula propagated narratives in which Trojan memory became embedded in civic consciousness. Through repeated engagement, populations internalized symbolic hierarchies, heroic exemplars, and strategic paradigms that supported both communal identity and political legitimacy. A second interpretive insight follows. Cultural memory functions as infrastructure for social authority. By connecting contemporary rule to remembered heroism, city-states established continuity across temporal and generational divides, reinforcing both obedience and communal cohesion. The reinterpretation of Trojan heritage was also responsive to interpolis dynamics. In periods of rivalry, states emphasized particular episodes, alliances, or moral lessons that reinforced competitive identity. For example, accounts highlighting Aegean valor or Trojan hubris could be appropriated selectively to support contemporary claims of precedence, virtue, or military superiority. This adaptive use underscores the flexibility of narrative memory in addressing both internal governance and external competition. Material culture further supported political appropriation. Monuments, dedications, and artistic representations, ranging from temple reliefs to votive offerings, illustrated heroes and events from the Trojan tradition. Such visual media reinforced ideological claims and made abstract narrative memory tangible within civic spaces. A third interpretive insight emerges. Narrative memory, literary tradition, and material culture operated in concert to legitimize authority. Written epics, public performance, and commemorative art created a multi-layered system in which Troy functioned as both moral exemplar and political symbol. The strategic deployment of Trojan memory extended to diplomatic and military contexts. Leaders invoked heroic precedent to justify campaigns, mobilize allies, or assert historical continuity with past conquest. By framing contemporary actions within the epic paradigm, political actors cultivated legitimacy and garnered popular support for initiatives that might otherwise lack immediate historical grounding. It is also important to note the selective nature of appropriation. The Trojan narrative was not monolithic. It offered multiple interpretive possibilities. Different cities and leaders emphasized lineage, virtue, tactical cunning, or divine sanction according to context, highlighting the narrative's malleability. This versatility contributed to its enduring relevance across centuries and diverse political landscapes. By the classical period, the Trojan legacy had become deeply entrenched in Greek civic and cultural identity. Sparta, Athens, and other city-states employed the memory of Bronze Age conflict not merely as entertainment or moral lesson, but as a tool of governance, legitimacy, and ideological cohesion. Through performance, literature, and ritual, the Trojan narrative continued to shape perceptions of authority, ancestry, and societal values. The strategic engagement with Troy demonstrates a broader pattern in Greek historiography. Memory and myth functioned as active instruments of political life. Far from being passive records of the past, epic traditions were mobilized to address contemporary social, military, and ideological challenges, embedding the heroic age within the operational consciousness of the polis. In conclusion, Greek political use of the Trojan narrative illustrates how cultural memory can reinforce authority, unify communities, and provide moral and strategic precedent. By connecting contemporary governance and military action to the heroic past, city-states and leaders asserted legitimacy, cultivated civic identity, and maintained continuity across generations. Rome would later adopt this framework, integrating the Trojan myth into its own political and cultural ideology. Troy became Rome's origin. In the Roman imagination, the fall of Troy was transformed from a distant Greek memory into a foundational narrative for Roman identity. Central to this process was the figure of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who survived the city's destruction and, according to later literary and ideological constructions, established the lineage from which Rome would emerge. By linking Rome to the epic past of the Trojan War, Roman writers and rulers created a sense of historical legitimacy and continuity that connected contemporary political authority to heroic and divine precedent. The earliest literary attestations of Aeneas appear in Greek sources, including Homeric references in the Iliad, which mention him as a warrior allied with the Trojans. However, it was the Roman literary tradition, particularly Virgil's Aeneid, composed during the reign of Augustus in the 1st century BCE, that elevated Aeneas into the central founding figure of Roman history. Virgil's narrative interwove mythic memory with contemporary political aims, portraying Aeneas as pious, dutiful, and destined to lay the groundwork for Rome's eventual empire. A first interpretive insight emerges here. The Trojan legacy was deliberately reinterpreted to serve Roman ideological purposes. By framing Aeneas as the progenitor of Roman civilization, Virgil and subsequent authors created a narrative that justified political consolidation, imperial ambition, and the Augustan moral program. The Aeneid presents the journey of Aeneas as both literal and symbolic. His flight from Troy reflects the consequences of the city's destruction, including displacement, loss of homeland, and the challenges of establishing new political and social structures. The epic emphasizes continuity between Trojan cultural values, such as leadership, martial skill, and piety toward the gods, and the emergent Roman ethos. In this way, the narrative integrates historical memory with literary and moral instruction. Roman engagement with Trojan memory extended beyond literature. Augustus and his contemporaries actively promoted the Trojan foundation myth as part of public ideology. Monuments, coinage, and visual arts celebrated Aeneas and his descendants, linking Rome's ruling elite to heroic and divine ancestry. This appropriation reinforced the legitimacy of the Julio-Claudian line, portraying imperial authority as the culmination of an epic historical trajectory. A second interpretive insight follows. The adaptation of Trojan memory into Roman foundational mythology demonstrates the utility of epic tradition as a tool of political legitimation. Narrative, ritual, and visual representation combined to produce a coherent ideological framework that justified contemporary power structures. The Roman reinterpretation of Troy also engaged with prior Greek memory. While Homeric and later Greek accounts emphasized the Aegean perspective and Pan-Hellenic identity, Roman narratives reframed the conflict to center on Trojan survival and continuity. By privileging the Trojan viewpoint, Rome claimed moral and historical precedence, positioning itself as the heir of heroic memory rather than its successor. The construction of Aeneas as a moral exemplar reflects both literary and political priorities. Virgil emphasizes pietas, the balance of duty to gods, family, and community, linking personal virtue to civic stability. This ideological framing allowed Roman audiences to see in Troy's destruction both a cautionary tale and a justification for order, governance, and expansion. The heroic narrative became inseparable from civic ideology. Archaeological and textual evidence suggest that Roman engagement with Troy was less concerned with historical verification and more with symbolic continuity. Troy functioned as a repository of heroic and ancestral prestige rather than a site of empirically grounded reconstruction. This symbolic function parallels the Greek use of Homeric memory for political purposes, though with the added dimension of founding myth. A third interpretive insight arises here. Mythic and literary reinterpretation enables societies to integrate historical memory into evolving political, social, and moral frameworks. For Rome, Troy was not merely a past event but a living source of identity and legitimacy. The Trojan origin narrative also facilitated Rome's broader engagement with Mediterranean heritage. By claiming descent from Troy, Romans linked themselves to the wider Bronze Age world, including Greek heroic culture, Anatolian geography, and the epic tradition. This connection provided both cultural prestige and a sense of historical inevitability for Roman expansion, framing conquest as fulfillment of ancestral destiny. Over time, Roman authors and historians Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and others continued to elaborate and interpret the Trojan foundation myth. These works reinforced the political and moral lessons embedded in the narrative, ensuring that successive generations understood Rome's origins as inseparable from the memory of Troy. The myth thus functioned as both history and moral exemplar, shaping collective consciousness and civic identity. In summary, Rome transformed Troy from a site of Greek memory into the foundational narrative of Roman civilization. Aeneas, as the surviving Trojan hero, bridged the Bronze Age past with Roman political and cultural identity. Through literature, art, and ideology, Troy became a symbol of continuity, virtue, and legitimacy, establishing a model for the interweaving of historical memory and political purpose. Memory influenced power, demonstrating how societies reinterpret events of the distant past to construct contemporary authority, identity, and ideological cohesion. This Roman engagement with Troy set a precedent for later historiography, ensuring that the Trojan War continued to resonate across cultures and epochs. Troy reemerged from the ground. The rediscovery and excavation of Hizarlik, identified as the site of ancient Troy, transformed the city from literary memory into a subject of systematic archaeological inquiry. Beginning in the late 19th century, excavations revealed layers of settlement spanning millennia, providing tangible evidence of urban continuity, fortification, destruction, and cultural interaction. These findings established a factual framework for assessing the historical plausibility of the Trojan War and its surrounding contexts. Heinrich Schliemann initiated the first major excavations in 1870, motivated by Homeric epic as well as personal ambition. Working with local laborers and later under more scientific guidance, Schliemann uncovered extensive fortifications, gates, and evidence of wealth, including the famous Priam's treasure. Although his methods lacked modern stratigraphic precision, Schliemann's work demonstrated that the site contained multiple urban layers and was significantly older than previously assumed. His identification of Troy via as the Homeric city influenced decades of scholarly interpretation, despite methodological shortcomings. Wilhelm Dorpfeld, Schliemann's successor, emphasized stratigraphic sequencing, refining understanding of Troy's occupational phases. He proposed correlations between specific layers and historical or literary events, highlighting Troy 6 and VIA as major Bronze Age centers. Dorpfeld's work introduced methodological rigor that prioritized architectural and stratigraphic evidence over anecdotal literary correlation, setting a precedent for modern archaeological standards. In the 20th century, Carl Blegen conducted extensive excavations at Hizarlik, applying systematic stratigraphy, ceramics analysis, and comparative studies. Blegen clarified the chronological sequence of Troy 6 VIA, providing precise dating for fortifications, domestic structures, and destruction horizons. His work demonstrated that Troy had experienced repeated cycles of construction, occupation, and violent destruction, consistent with patterns observed in other late Bronze Age settlements. Blegen's research also integrated broader regional analysis, situating Troy within Aegean, Anatolian, and Eastern Mediterranean networks. A first interpretive insight emerges here. The layered complexity of Troy illustrates the interplay between urban resilience and vulnerability. Repeated reconstruction reflects both the strategic importance of the site and the recurring hazards of regional conflict, seismic activity, and economic disruption. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Klaus P. Korfmann advanced understanding through modern excavation techniques, including geophysical survey, stratigraphic refinement, and interdisciplinary approaches. His work emphasized the urban extent of Troy, defensive features, and connections to surrounding landscapes. Korfmann's research underscored the city's capacity to function as a fortified regional center, controlling trade routes and serving as a hub for Bronze Age political and economic activity. Material culture recovered across these campaigns, including pottery, metalwork, and architectural remains, supports the identification of Troy as a major late Bronze Age city. Shaft graves, fortification walls, gates, and evidence of domestic, industrial, and ritual activity demonstrate urban complexity and societal organization. Artifacts such as imported ceramics and weapons indicate participation in long-distance trade and interaction with Mycenaean, Anatolian, and Levantine polities. A second interpretive insight follows. Archaeological evidence situates Troy not merely as a literary construct, but as a tangible Bronze Age urban center embedded within broader geopolitical and economic networks. Its physical reality provides context for evaluating Homeric tradition and understanding the systemic forces that shaped the city's development and vulnerability. Methodological advances have refined chronological and cultural interpretation. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and ceramic typology allow precise dating of destruction horizons, while remote sensing and GIS mapping provide insight into urban layout, fortifications, and regional connectivity. Comparative study of contemporaneous sites, including Mycenaean palaces and Hittite centers, situates Troy within a systemic understanding of late Bronze Age political, economic, and military structures. The integration of textual evidence from Hittite archives, including references to Wilusa and Ahiawa, further enriches interpretation. Treaties, correspondence, and administrative records corroborate the existence of a politically significant site in northwestern Anatolia, capable of engaging in diplomacy, tribute, and conflict. The convergence of archaeological and textual data strengthens the argument that Troy functioned as a major regional power and strategic node. A third interpretive insight emerges. Interdisciplinary research demonstrates that historical assessment requires both material evidence and critical engagement with textual sources. Archaeology provides structural and material data, while Hittite records and comparative studies contextualize political, economic, and military significance. Debates over the Homeric correlation continue. While some scholars align Troy via with the war described in the Iliad, others caution against direct identification, emphasizing temporal gaps, narrative embellishment, and literary construction. The city's destruction, while historically attested, may not correspond exactly to the war's epic depiction. Nevertheless, the archaeological record confirms that Troy experienced significant late Bronze Age conflict, urban complexity, and strategic prominence, conditions consistent with the type of war preserved in oral and literary memory. Modern scholarship also addresses methodological limitations of earlier work. Schliemann's treasure hunting, while sensational, overlooked context. Dorpfeld and Blegen introduced stratigraphy and typology. Korfmann emphasized urban scale and interdisciplinary evidence. Current research continues to refine site chronology, assess population estimates, and investigate trade, fortification, and settlement patterns, demonstrating the dynamic nature of archaeological inquiry. In conclusion, the excavation history of Troy illustrates both the challenges and achievements of reconstructing ancient realities. From Schliemann's initial trenches to contemporary geophysical surveys, archaeologists have revealed a complex urban site with multiple occupational layers, fortified structures, evidence of destruction, and participation in regional networks. These discoveries confirm that Troy was a real, significant center of the late Bronze Age, providing a factual basis for assessing Homeric memory and understanding the geopolitical and cultural environment of the period. Evidence demands interpretation. The material and textual record provides a foundation for reconstructing Troy's historical role, but scholarly analysis must distinguish between archaeological fact, literary tradition, and later ideological adaptation. This careful synthesis enables modern historians and archaeologists to evaluate the city's significance, the plausibility of conflict narratives, and the broader context of late Bronze Age political, economic, and cultural systems. The question remains precise, not romantic. Despite centuries of scholarship, excavation, and literary analysis, historians continue to debate whether a singular conflict corresponds to the Trojan War described in Homeric epics. Modern inquiry emphasizes a critical, evidence-based approach, assessing archaeological, textual, and comparative data while avoiding the conflation of legend with historical certainty. Archaeological evidence confirms that Troy was a fortified city of strategic significance in northwestern Anatolia, with Troy via showing signs of violent destruction around 1190 BCE. Fortified walls, burned layers, and abrupt abandonment indicate conflict or disaster. Additionally, the city's control of trade routes linking the Aegean and the Black Sea aligns with economic motivations often cited as underlying the epic war. These material facts support the plausibility of a Bronze Age military confrontation at Troy. Textual sources offer additional, though indirect, corroboration. Hittite records reference Wilusa, a polity corresponding geographically with Troy, and mention interactions with Aegean, often associated with Mycenaean Greeks. Treaties such as the Alexandria Agreement and diplomatic correspondence suggest that political and military tensions existed between these powers. While these sources do not describe a Homeric war, they confirm that Troy occupied a politically contested position, making conflict a plausible outcome. A first interpretive insight emerges here. Historical plausibility rests on the convergence of material evidence, textual reference, and strategic context. Troy's archaeological destruction, regional political entanglements, and Mycenaean expansion all point to conditions conducive to warfare, though not necessarily the narrative scope or duration depicted in epic tradition. Yet significant limitations constrain certainty. The Homeric epics were composed several centuries after the supposed events, incorporating oral tradition, poetic license, and narrative embellishment. While some details, armament, fortifications, and maritime logistics align with Bronze Age realities, many elements reflect literary construction rather than eyewitness reporting. Chronological gaps between archaeological layers and narrative timelines further complicate attempts to link a specific war to Troy via. Scholarly consensus acknowledges this ambiguity. Most historians accept that Troy was real, strategically important, and likely involved in conflict with Mycenaean or Anatolian polities. However, few assert that the Iliad preserves a literal account of a 10-year siege or the specific sequence of events described. The war, if it occurred, may have been a shorter conflict or a series of engagements, subsequently magnified and mythologized in oral tradition. A second interpretive insight follows. The Trojan War exemplifies the transformation of historical events into collective memory. Archaeology provides the framework of reality, while oral and literary transmission shaped the narrative into a cultural and moral exemplar, preserving social memory rather than precise chronology. Comparative analysis reinforces this perspective. Similarities between Troy via destruction and contemporaneous Mycenaean palace collapses highlight patterns of late Bronze Age instability. These include economic stress, population movement, and localized warfare. Such evidence suggests that Troy's fall fits broader regional trends of systemic disruption rather than representing an isolated legendary event. In this sense, the war functions as both historically plausible and emblematic of the era's turbulence. A third interpretive insight arises. Evaluating Troy within its wider geopolitical and economic network contextualizes potential conflict, moving the analysis beyond legend towards systemic historical understanding. Even if a singular epic war did not occur, the site's strategic and political importance makes violent confrontation highly credible. Historiographical debate also addresses methodological challenges. Earlier approaches, influenced by romantic or nationalistic agendas, often sought to confirm Homeric narratives literally. Modern scholarship prioritizes interdisciplinary methods, integrating stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, Hittite textual analysis, and comparative archaeology. This evidence-driven approach acknowledges uncertainty while providing a structured framework for assessing probability and context. It is important to note the distinction between evidence for conflict and evidence for mythic elements. Archaeology can identify destruction, fortifications, and human activity, but cannot confirm the roles of individual actors, the 10-year duration, or divine intervention described in epic poetry. Thus, scholarly conclusions maintain a careful balance, acknowledging the reality of Bronze Age warfare while recognizing the constructed narrative of the Homeric tradition. Cultural memory reinforces the significance of Troy beyond historical verification. The city's destruction, heroic narratives, and subsequent literary codification shaped Greek and Roman identity, political ideology, and moral frameworks. Whether or not a singular war occurred as described, the memory of conflict provided continuity, meaning, and reference for societies across centuries. In conclusion, the question of the Trojan War exemplifies the interface between archaeology, history, and literary tradition. Evidence supports the existence of a fortified city engaged in conflict with Mycenaean and regional powers during the Late Bronze Age. Strategic importance, destruction layers, and textual references suggest plausibility for military confrontation. At the same time, the literary narrative, particularly as preserved in Homer, reflects centuries of oral transmission, interpretive framing, and mythic elaboration. The Trojan War thus remains a historiographical and archaeological challenge. It demonstrates the limits of certainty in reconstructing ancient events, emphasizing the need for careful, interdisciplinary analysis. By separating material fact from literary embellishment while respecting the role of memory, modern scholarship constructs a balanced understanding of Troy's historical significance. Memory, myth, and evidence converge to shape the city's enduring legacy. Troy's archaeological reality confirms its role as a Bronze Age power, while literary and cultural transmission ensures that its story continues to resonate. The historical assessment is neither purely romantic nor definitively closed. It is a precise, disciplined inquiry into the intersection of human activity, conflict, and memory. From the excavated walls of Hazarlik to the verses of Homer, the story of Troy reminds us how history, memory, and myth intersect. To explore more deeply the civilizations, conflicts, and ideas that shaped our world, subscribe to Nightfall History and continue your journey through the past. Dive into our playlists for full-length documentaries and uncover the histories behind the legends.